Before we begin tonight's journey into one of the most persistent, unexplained phenomena in American history, I want to ask a small favour. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know and allows us to keep bringing you these stories week after week. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review truly makes a massive difference in helping others discover this content. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening from, whether you're winding down for the night in Australia, catching this during your commute in London, or listening from a late shift in Tokyo. The global community we're building here is something truly special. If you enjoy what we do here, subscribing means the world to us. It's free, takes just a second, and ensures you never miss a story. Before we dive in, I want to give a huge thank you to Jeff Anon for suggesting this topic. This is one of those stories that's been hiding in plain sight for over a century, and it's about time we examined it closely. The Marfa lights represent something rare in the world of unexplained phenomena, a mystery with documented witnesses spanning 3 different centuries, consistent behavioural patterns, and absolutely no satisfying explanation despite serious scientific inquiry. Now, let's begin. The lights older than the highway, long before paved roads carved their way through the Texas desert, long before car headlights swept across the darkness, long before electric grids hummed with power or aircraft crossed the night sky. Lights were already moving out there, silent, unexplained, persistent. Near the small town of Marfa in West Texas, something appears in the darkness that has refused every explanation offered to it for more than 140 years. These are not distant city lights reflecting off low clouds. They are not reflections or mirages in any conventional sense. They are not swamp gas, ball lightning, or St. Elmo's fire. They are the Marfa lights, and they have been witnessed by ranchers, soldiers, railroad workers, scientists, law enforcement officers, and skeptics alike. The question is not whether the lights exist. Too many people have seen them. Too many reports align across decades and generations. Too many photographs and videos have captured something, even if those images raise more questions than they answer. The question is what they are, where they come from, why they appear in this specific location, and why after more than a century of scientific inquiry, technological advancement and determined investigation, we still have no definitive answer. Marfa sits in the high desert of West Texas, roughly 60 miles north of the Mexican border. The elevation here is nearly 5,000 feet, placing the town in a landscape that feels simultaneously vast and intimate. The sky stretches forever, unbroken by trees or tall buildings. At night the darkness is absolute, the kind of darkness that existed before humanity learned to push it back with artificial light. The stars here are so bright they cast shadows. The Milky Way arches overhead like a river of light. This is important context. In a place this dark, any light stands out. Local residents know their landscape intimately. They know which lights belong to distant ranches, which are vehicles on far-off roads, which are towers or communication equipment. When something appears that does not fit these categories, they notice, and they have been noticing for a very long time. If these lights existed before modern technology, before highways and electric grids, before aircraft and communication towers, before any of the infrastructure we might use to explain them away, then what exactly are we seeing? What force, natural or otherwise, has been creating luminous phenomena in the West Texas desert since before the Civil War? This is not a story about a single sighting that spawned legends. This is not about rumours or tall tales passed down through generations and embellished with each retelling. This is about a documented, ongoing phenomenon that continues to this day. People can visit Marfa tonight, stand at the official viewing area, and potentially witness the same thing that a young ranch foreman named Robert Reed Ellison witnessed in 1883. The persistence is what makes it unsettling. Mysteries that appear once and vanish can be dismissed, rationalised, forgotten. But mysteries that return, that occupy the same space year after year, decade after decade, century after century, demand our attention. They force us to confront the limits of our understanding and acknowledge that despite all our advances in science and technology, some things still refuse to be explained. Chapter 1. The first recorded witnesses. Year was 1883. The American Civil War had ended less than 20 years earlier. The frontier was still being settled. Texas, vast and largely empty, was a place where ranching defined the economy and the culture. Towns were few and far between, connected by rough trails that turned to mud in rain and dust in drought. The night sky was darker than most people living today can possibly imagine, unmarred by light pollution or the glow of distant cities. Robert Reed Ellison was 25 years old, a young ranch foreman working for the Macho Land and Cattle Company, near what would eventually become the town of Marfa. He was a practical man, born to frontier life, accustomed to hard work and long hours. His job required him to spend days on horseback, managing cattle across thousands of acres of open range, ensuring the herd was healthy and accounted for, watching for predators and thieves. Ellison was not prone to flights of fancy. His survival and livelihood depended on clear thinking and accurate observation. In the desert, mistaking a shadow for a threat or a landmark for something else could be fatal. Men like Ellison learned to trust their eyes and their judgment. On a clear night in spring of 1883, Ellison was riding the perimeter of the ranch property. This was routine work, a necessary task to ensure nothing had gone wrong with the herd during the day. The horse beneath him moved with the steady rhythm of an animal that had walked this ground 1,000 times before. The air was cool, carrying the scent of creosote and desert sage. Then he saw them, lights in the distance, soft, yellowish, glowing steadily against the black horizon. They appeared to be perhaps a mile away, maybe less, hovering at what seemed to be ground level. Ellison's first thought was simple and practical. Campfires, perhaps travellers passing through, or another ranch crew working late, or even potential cattle rustlers. But something about the lights troubled him immediately. They did not flicker like campfires. Flames move, they dance, they respond to wind. These lights burned steady and constant. They did not seem to move in the way firelight moves, with that characteristic wavering quality. They simply hovered there, bright and unnatural, in a place where Ellison knew there were no settlements, no established campsites, no reason for anyone to be. Curiosity overtook caution. Ellison turned his horse toward the lights and began riding in their direction. He expected to find travellers, perhaps lost or in need of assistance. The code of the West demanded that he at least investigate, ensure no one was in trouble. The journey took longer than he expected. The desert has a way of distorting distance, especially at night. What looks close can be miles away. The flat terrain offers few reference points. But Ellison pressed on, keeping his eyes fixed on the lights, using them as a beacon to guide him across the dark landscape. His horse began to act strangely as they drew closer. The animal's ears flattened back, its steps became hesitant. Horses have senses humans lack. They perceive things we cannot, detect dangers we miss. Ellison felt the tension in the animal beneath him, but urged it forward. After what he later estimated to be 20 or 30 minutes of riding, Ellison reached the location where the lights had been. He found nothing. No campfire, no travellers, no tents or horses or wagons, no evidence anyone had been there at all. The ground was undisturbed, showing only the natural patterns of windswept sand and scattered rocks. There were no tracks, no ash, no signs of human presence whatsoever. He dismounted and walked the area carefully, searching by moonlight for anything that might explain what he had seen. Nothing. The desert was empty. Confused, Ellison turned back toward his original position and saw the lights again. But now they were farther away, in a completely different direction from where he had just searched. They glowed with that same steady, unnatural brightness, as if mocking his attempt to reach them. He stood there for a long moment, watching them. Part of him wanted to ride toward them again, to solve this mystery. But his horse was agitated, and something in his gut told him that chasing the lights further would be pointless. Whatever they were, they did not want to be found. Ellison rode back to the ranch that night and told no one what he had seen. In 1883, in a culture where reputation and credibility mattered enormously, strange stories could damage a man's standing. Ellison was young, still establishing himself as a reliable foreman. Talking about mysterious lights in the desert could get him labelled as unreliable, superstitious, or worse. But he did not forget. Over the following months and years, Ellison occasionally saw the lights again while riding at night. Sometimes they were distant, barely visible. Other times they were closer, bright enough to illuminate the ground beneath them. He never rode toward them again. He simply noted their presence and continued with his work. It was not until the early 1900s, when other residents of the newly established town of Marfa began reporting similar sightings, that Ellison finally shared his experience. By then, he was an established rancher with a solid reputation. His testimony carried weight. When he described what he had seen in 1883, people listened. His account became the first documented witness testimony of the Marfa lights, recorded in local newspapers and county records. But Ellison himself believed the phenomenon was older than his sighting. He had spoken with elderly Mexican ranchers who claimed their fathers and grandfathers had seen the lights. Apache elders told stories of spirit lights that danced in the desert, long before white settlers arrived. What troubled Ellison most, even decades after that first sighting, was the behaviour of the lights. They had appeared, drawn him in, and vanished the moment he came close. Then they had reappeared elsewhere, as if demonstrating that they controlled the encounter, not him. It was as if they were aware of him, as if they knew he was coming and moved deliberately to stay out of reach. In interviews late in his life, Ellison maintained that he had no explanation for what he had seen. He rejected the idea that they were campfires or lanterns, because he had found no evidence of human presence. He rejected the idea that they were natural gas vents or mineral phosphorescence, because their movements were too deliberate. He died in 1933, 50 years after his first sighting, having never received a satisfying answer to what he had witnessed in the desert that night. His testimony stands as the first documented account in an ongoing phenomenon that continues to this day. Chapter 2. A pattern. Emerges over the following decades, the reports multiplied. Ranchers, railroad workers, miners, and law enforcement officers all reported seeing the lights. The descriptions were remarkably consistent, despite coming from people who had never spoken to one another, who lived years or even decades apart, and who had no reason to coordinate their stories. The lights appeared after sunset, usually in the hours between dusk and midnight, though occasionally witnesses reported seeing them in the early morning hours before dawn. They hovered above the ground, sometimes low enough that witnesses estimated them to be at eye level, sometimes higher, appearing to float hundreds of feet in the air. They glowed in colours ranging from white to yellow to orange to red, occasionally shifting between hues as witnesses watched. What made the lights particularly unsettling was their behaviour. They would split into multiple orbs, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 or more, sometimes as many as a dozen. These orbs would then move independently, floating horizontally across the desert or rising vertically into the air before descending again. They moved smoothly, without the jerking or bouncing motion one would expect from lanterns or torches carried by people. They did not bob or sway, they simply glided, as if freed from normal physical constraints, and critically, they were seen long before automobiles became common in the region. This fact cannot be overstated. The earliest widespread reports date back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, when cars were rare novelties owned only by the very wealthy, when highways did not exist, when West Texas was still frontier country, where horses and wagons were the primary means of transportation. The town of Marfa was not officially established until 1883, the same year as Ellison's sighting. The railroad reached the area in 1881, bringing workers and their families to the region. These railroad employees provided some of the most detailed, early accounts of the lights. A conductor named James Mitchell reported in 1897 that he had seen the lights on multiple occasions, while running the evening route from Alpine to Marfa. He described them as glowing orbs that appeared alongside the tracks, keeping pace with the train for several minutes before veering off into the desert. Mitchell noted that passengers would often point out the lights, asking him what they were. He had no answer to give them. A telegraph operator named Margaret Westfall, stationed in Marfa in the early 1900s, kept a personal journal in which she documented sightings of the lights. Her entries, preserved in the County Historical Society archives, provide valuable insights into the frequency and behaviour of the phenomenon during that era. One entry from 1904 reads, "Saw the lights again tonight, 3 of them, moving east to west along the southern horizon. They appeared around 8 o'clock and remained visible for nearly an hour. Thomas came to the office to see them as well. He attempted to ride toward them but returned after 20 minutes, saying they vanished as he approached. We were at a loss to explain what causes them." Another entry from 1907 notes, "The lights performed their strangest display yet. One large orb appeared, then split into 5 smaller ones. These smaller lights arranged themselves in a perfect line, hovered for perhaps 10 minutes, then merged back into a single orb before vanishing. I have lived in many places and seen many strange things, but nothing quite like this." Law enforcement officers who patrolled the remote stretches of road in the early 20th century reported the lights with a mixture of curiosity and frustration. Sheriff Tom Cowan, who served Presidio County from 1910 to 1924, kept official records of unusual incidents in his jurisdiction. Among reports of cattle theft, disputes, and occasional violence, he documented multiple sightings of unexplained lights. In a report from 1913, Sheriff Cowan wrote, "Received multiple reports of lights seen south of town. Investigated personally with Deputy Harrison. We observed the lights from the road for approximately 45 minutes. They appeared to be 3 separate sources of light, moving independently. We attempted to approach on horseback. The lights retreated as we advanced. When we stopped, the lights stopped. When we advanced again, they retreated again. We were unable to determine their source or nature. The pattern was consistent across all these accounts. The lights appeared, they moved in unusual ways, they split and merged, and they vanished or retreated when approached. No one could predict when they would show up or how long they would last. Some nights brought vivid, active displays that lasted for hours. Other nights brought nothing at all, despite ideal viewing conditions. The inconsistency became part of the mystery. If the lights were a natural phenomenon tied to predictable atmospheric conditions, they should appear more regularly. Certain weather patterns, certain temperatures, certain humidity levels should trigger them reliably. But no such correlation was ever found. The lights appeared in clear weather and overcast weather. They appeared in summer and winter. They appeared when the air was dry and when it was humid. If they were man-made, someone should have been able to track their source. In a region as sparsely populated as West Texas, with few settlements and fewer still with the resources to create mysterious lights, identifying the responsible party should have been straightforward. But no hoaxer was ever caught. No equipment was ever found. No person ever came forward to claim responsibility. The lights simply appeared, performed their strange aerial ballet, and vanished without explanation. By the 1920s, the phenomenon had become well known throughout the Yall region. Ranching families who had lived in the area for generations spoke of the lights as part of the landscape, something as natural and expected as thunderstorms or dust devils, if considerably more mysterious. One rancher named William Bates, whose family had operated a cattle ranch south of Marfa since the 1870s, gave an interview to a regional newspaper in 1926. He said, "My father saw those lights. My grandfather saw them. I've seen them myself more times than I can count. We don't know what they are. Sometimes I think there's some kind of natural fire, gas coming up from the ground maybe. Other times I watch them move and split apart and come back together, and I know that's not any kind of gas. Whatever they are, they've been here longer than we have, and they'll probably be here long after we're gone." This perspective was common among long-time residents. The lights were mysterious, but they were also familiar. They did not harm anyone. They did not damage property. They simply appeared and disappeared, a permanent mystery in a landscape full of harsh realities and practical concerns. But as the 20th century progressed, and Marfa grew from a tiny railroad stop into an established town, more people began paying attention to the lights, and with that attention came the inevitable search for explanations. Chapter 3: The Town Takes Notice. By the early 1900s, the lights had become part of local legend. The town of Marfa, still small and isolated, began to embrace the mystery in the way frontier communities often embrace the peculiarities of their region. The lights were talked about in the general store, discussed at church socials, debated in the town's single saloon. Families began making it a tradition to watch for the lights on clear nights. Parents would take their children out to areas with good visibility, pointing toward the southern horizon, telling them the stories passed down through generations. The lights were not feared exactly, but they were respected. People understood that whatever they were witnessing was beyond normal explanation, and there was something appropriate about maintaining a certain distance, both physical and emotional. Visitors began arriving in small numbers, drawn by rumours of the phenomenon. Some came as skeptics, expecting to quickly debunk the stories and prove that frontier folk were prone to exaggeration. Others came as believers, hoping to witness something unexplainable, seeking confirmation that the world held mysteries science could not yet penetrate. Both groups left with more questions than answers. The town responded by informally designating certain areas as good viewing locations. The most popular was a stretch of land along the road leading south from town, where the terrain offered unobstructed views of the desert and distant mountains. On clear nights, small groups would gather there, families spreading blankets on the ground, couples sitting in truck beds, individuals standing alone with binoculars trained on the darkness. Some nights nothing appeared. The desert remained dark and still. People would wait for hours, scanning the horizon, seeing only stars and the occasional light from a distant ranch. They would return home disappointed, wondering if the whole thing was just folklore, stories embellished over time until they bore little resemblance to whatever mundane reality had inspired them. Other nights, the lights performed. A local schoolteacher named Elizabeth Hartley kept a detailed journal of her experiences watching for the lights between 1928 and 1945. Her writings, preserved by her descendants and eventually donated to the Marfa Historical Society, provide valuable insight into both the phenomenon itself and the community's relationship with it. One entry from June of 1930 reads, "Took my students out to watch for the lights this evening as several had never seen them. We waited from sunset until nearly 10 o'clock. Just as some of the children were becoming restless and suggesting we give up, the lights appeared. 2 orbs, bright orange in colour, rising from the southern horizon. The children gasped. Even I, who have seen them many times, felt that familiar sense of wonder and unease. The orbs hovered for perhaps 5 minutes, then began moving horizontally, travelling from east to west. As they moved, they left trails of light behind them, faint but visible. Then they simply vanished, as if someone had extinguished a lamp. The children asked me what causes them. I had to admit I did not know." Another entry from September of 1934 describes a more dramatic display. "The lights tonight were the most active I have ever witnessed. It began with a single large orb, white in colour, appearing low on the horizon. As we watched, it split into 3 separate lights. These 3 then split further, creating 9 distinct orbs. They arranged themselves in a triangular formation and remained that way for at least 20 minutes. Then, one by one, the outer lights began to fade, leaving only the 3 original orbs. These merged back into a single light, which grew brighter, then dimmed and vanished. The entire display lasted nearly an hour. Several other families were watching with us, and we all saw the same thing. I cannot imagine any natural or man-made explanation for such behaviour. The consistency of these accounts across multiple witnesses is significant. People watching from the same location at the same time all reported seeing the same movements, the same colours, the same patterns. This rules out individual hallucination or misperception. Whatever the lights were, they were physically present, emitting real photons that could be seen by anyone with a clear view. The town's newspaper, the Marfa Sentinel, began covering the phenomenon more regularly in the 1930s. Articles described recent sightings, interviewed witnesses, and proposed various theories. The editor, a man named Harold Peterson, took the lights seriously, treating them as a legitimate mystery, worthy of investigation rather than as frontier superstition or entertainment. One editorial from 1936 argued, "The lights that appear south of our town have been witnessed by too many reliable citizens to be dismissed as myth or exaggeration. Ranchers, lawmen, teachers, merchants, and travellers have all reported seeing them. The consistency of these reports, spanning decades, suggests a real phenomenon requiring serious scientific inquiry. We call upon the State University to send researchers to investigate. Our community deserves answers." No researchers came, at least not in the 1930s. The Great Depression had more immediate concerns occupying the attention of academic institutions and government agencies. Remote lights in the West Texas desert were not a priority when unemployment was at record levels and the Dust Bowl was destroying farms across the plains. But the lights did not need official recognition to continue. They appeared when they appeared, indifferent to human attention or lack thereof. Local law began to develop around the phenomenon. Some claim the lights appeared more frequently during certain phases of the moon, though careful record-keeping by amateur observers like Elizabeth Hartley failed to confirm any correlation. Others claimed the lights were more active during summer months, though again detailed records showed sightings occurred year-round with no clear seasonal pattern. A few individuals claimed to have discovered patterns that allowed them to predict when the lights would appear. One rancher insisted the lights always appeared 3 days after heavy rain. Another claimed they appeared only when the temperature dropped below a certain threshold at night. But none of these prediction methods proved reliable when tested by others. The truth was simple. No one could predict when the lights would appear. They followed no discernible schedule. They obeyed no known rules. They simply were, appearing and vanishing according to logic unknown to human observers. This unpredictability became part of the experience. The lights did not perform on command. They appeared when they wanted to, and they vanished just as unpredictably. This randomness made the phenomenon more compelling, not less. If the lights had been predictable, they would have been easier to explain, easier to study, easier to categorize. But their sporadic appearances suggested something more complex was at work, something that resisted easy analysis. The town's relationship with the lights became symbiotic. The mystery brought attention and a small amount of tourism, important for a community struggling through the Depression years. But the people of Marfa were not manufacturing a hoax or exaggerating for economic benefit. They genuinely did not know what the lights were, and most residents had seen them personally multiple times. The phenomenon was real, even if its cause remained unknown. By the 1940s, the Marfa lights had become part of the town's identity. Residents spoke of them with a mixture of pride and genuine curiosity. They were something unique to this place, a mystery that belonged to them, and unlike many mysteries, these lights could still be witnessed. They were not relics of the past or stories that might have been true once upon a time. They were ongoing, active, and available to anyone willing to wait in the darkness. Chapter 4. The Headlight Explanation. As the 20th century progressed and scientific inquiry became more rigorous and widespread, researchers began searching for rational explanations for the Marfa lights. The most popular theory, and the one still cited by skeptics today, is that the lights are refracted car headlights from distant highways. The theory, first proposed seriously in the 1960s, goes like this. Under certain atmospheric conditions, light from vehicles travelling on Highway 67, which runs south of Marfa, can be refracted and reflected through layers of air with different temperatures and densities. This creates a mirage effect, making distant headlights appear as floating orbs of light hovering above the desert, rather than moving along the ground. The scientific principle underlying this explanation is well established. Atmospheric refraction occurs when light passes through air layers of different temperatures. Hot air near the ground and cooler air above create a refractive boundary that can bend light rays, causing them to curve and creating optical illusions. This is the same principle that creates mirages of water on hot highways, or makes the sun appear flattened at sunset. Scientists conducted experiments to test this theory. In 1973, a team from the University of Texas positioned observers at the traditional Marfa viewing area while vehicles drove along Highway 67 at night with their headlights on. Under the right atmospheric conditions, they were able to reproduce visual effects similar to the Marfa lights. The headlights, when viewed from a distance through temperature-layered air, did appear to float above the road, split into multiple sources as the light refracted differently through various air layers and move in ways that seemed unusual and unexplained. The experiment was repeated several times with similar results. The team published their findings, concluding that the majority of Marfa light sightings could be explained as atmospheric refraction of headlights from Highway 67 and other distant roads in the area. The explanation gained widespread acceptance. It was neat, scientific, and required no extraordinary claims. The Marfa lights were simply an optical illusion, a trick of light and atmosphere. Interesting, but ultimately mundane. Media coverage of the phenomenon often cited this explanation, treating the mystery as essentially solved. But there was a significant problem with this explanation. It could not account for sightings that occurred before highways existed. Robert Reed Ellison saw the lights in 1883 when there were no cars at all. Highway 67 was not constructed until the 1920s. Numerous ranchers and settlers reported the lights throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, long before automobile traffic in the region was common enough to create the sustained light sources required for atmospheric refraction to produce visible effects. Railroad workers saw the lights from trains crossing the region in the 1880s and 90s, decades before Highway 67 existed. Telegraph operators documented sightings in the early 1900s. Sheriff Cowan and his deputies observed the lights in 1913 from locations that could not have provided views of any roads with vehicle traffic. If the lights are refracted car headlights, how do we explain sightings from 1883? How do we account for reports that predate modern transportation by 30, 40, or 50 years? How do we address the fact that the behavioural patterns described in early reports, the splitting, merging, hovering and reactive movement, match exactly what witnesses report today? Proponents of the headlight theory have proposed several responses to these questions. Some argue that earlier sightings may have been misidentifications of other phenomena, campfires, lanterns carried by travellers, perhaps even ball lightning or other rare natural electrical phenomena. They suggest that once cars arrived and atmospheric refraction of headlights became the dominant cause of light sightings, the earlier reports simply became conflated with the modern phenomenon. The name Marfa lights came to encompass both the historical mystery and the contemporary optical illusion, even though they may not be the same thing. Others suggest that the historical reports are unreliable. Memories fade, stories get embellished, and the human tendency to create patterns and narratives from ambiguous experiences means that early witnesses may have seen ordinary things and interpreted them as extraordinary. Without photographic evidence or scientific instruments to measure what the early witnesses saw, we cannot be certain their experiences match what people see today. But these counter-arguments require dismissing a century of consistent testimony. They require assuming that settlers, ranchers, railroad workers, law enforcement officers, teachers, and ordinary citizens across multiple generations all misidentified common light sources in the exact same way, reporting identical behavioural patterns despite having no contact with one another. They require ignoring the fact that people who lived in the desert, whose livelihoods depended on accurate observation and understanding of their environment, somehow consistently mistook campfires for mysterious floating lights, even though they were intimately familiar with what campfires looked like. They require believing that frontier people, many of whom were sceptical and practical by necessity, were somehow less capable of distinguishing between ordinary and extraordinary phenomena than modern observers. The historical record also shows that witnesses explicitly ruled out common explanations. Robert Reed Ellison did not simply see lights and assume they were mysterious. He rode toward them expecting to find campfires or travellers, and only concluded they were unexplained after finding no evidence of human presence. Sheriff Cowan and his deputies attempted to approach the lights specifically to determine their source, and noted in official reports that the lights appeared to deliberately retreat, a behaviour inconsistent with stationary campfires or distant vehicle headlights. The Headlight explanation works for some sightings. It may even explain the majority of recent sightings, particularly those that occur when atmospheric conditions are right for refraction, and when traffic on Highway 67 is steady. No serious researcher denies that some percentage of modern Marfa light sightings are explained by this phenomenon, but it does not work for all sightings, and it certainly does not work for the historical record. There were lights before there were headlights. There were sightings before there were highways. Unless we are willing to dismiss all pre-automobile reports as misidentifications or fabrications, we must acknowledge that the headlight explanation, while valid for some cases, does not close the book on the Marfa lights. This is where the conspiracy angle begins to take shape. If a simple, scientific explanation exists, but fails to account for crucial historical evidence, what are we missing? What are we being asked to overlook? Why has the headlight explanation been so widely promoted and accepted despite its obvious gaps? One possibility is that the headlight explanation serves a useful purpose for those who prefer mysteries to remain unsolved but not actively investigated. If the public believes the lights have been explained, there is less pressure for serious scientific research. If the phenomenon is dismissed as an optical illusion, funding agencies have no reason to allocate resources to studying it. If we accept that the mystery is solved, we stop asking difficult questions. But for anyone who examines the historical evidence carefully, the headlight explanation raises as many questions as it answers. And the most important question is this: if the lights existed before the explanation that supposedly accounts for them, what have they been all along? Chapter 5. The Military Interest. During the mid-20th century, military activity across Texas increased dramatically. The state's vast open spaces, sparse population, and favourable weather made it ideal for military installations, training facilities and weapons testing. The period from the 1940s through the 1970s saw the establishment of numerous air bases, radar stations and classified facilities across West Texas. Fort Bliss, located near El Paso, became one of the largest military installations in the United States. Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, less than 200 miles from Marfa, became a major testing facility for rocket propulsion systems and experimental aircraft. White Sands Proving Ground, also in New Mexico, was the site of the first atomic bomb test and continued to host weapons development programs throughout the Cold War. The military presence in the region was significant and growing, and some local residents began noticing changes in the behaviour of the Marfa lights during this period. The lights, which had always been mysterious, seemed to shift in character. Witnesses reported that they appeared lower to the ground than in previous decades. Their movements became more controlled, less erratic. Instead of the unpredictable drifting and splitting that characterized earlier sightings, some lights now moved in straight lines, made sharp angular turns, or hovered in place with unusual stability. One account from 1952 describes lights that appeared to fly in formation, maintaining precise distances from one another as they moved across the desert. The witness, a rancher named Thomas Mackenzie, watched through binoculars as 3 lights arranged themselves in a triangular pattern and flew south at what he estimated to be considerable speed, far faster than any aircraft he had seen before. Another report from 1957 describes lights that descended near a ranch house, close enough that the witness could see they were not orbs, but elongated, cigar-shaped objects emitting light from their surfaces. The witness, who requested anonymity when speaking to local reporters, said the objects made no sound, hovered for approximately 10 minutes, then accelerated vertically and vanished in seconds. These accounts differ significantly from earlier historical reports. The lights described by Ellison and other 19th century witnesses were mysterious but passive. They appeared, they drifted, they vanished. The lights described during the Cold War era sometimes exhibited behaviours suggesting advanced technology: formation flying, angular movements, rapid acceleration, controlled hovering. The timing is suspicious. As military activity in the region increased, reports of technologically sophisticated light phenomena increased as well. This correlation does not prove causation, but it raises questions. In 1953, a group of Air Force personnel stationed at a radar facility near Marfa decided to investigate the lights personally. According to accounts preserved in letters and personal journals, the group consisted of 6 men, all trained radar operators familiar with aircraft and atmospheric phenomena. They drove to the traditional viewing area on a Saturday night in October, bringing binoculars and cameras. The lights appeared around 9 o'clock. The airmen watched as multiple orbs rose from the southern horizon, glowing orange-red. Using binoculars, they attempted to discern details about the lights. One airman, whose letter to his wife was later made public by his family, wrote, "We expected to see headlights, or maybe searchlights from some facility. What we saw was nothing like that. The lights were self-luminous like heated metal. They moved independently, rising and falling, splitting apart and merging back together. We watched for nearly 2 hours. None of us could explain what we were seeing." The group decided to approach the lights. They drove south, using back roads that led into the desert toward the area where the lights appeared to be located. As they drew closer, the lights changed behaviour. Instead of vanishing, as historical reports suggested they would, the lights descended toward the vehicles. The airman's letter continues. "The lights came right at us. We stopped the trucks and got out. The lights hovered maybe 200 yards away, right above the desert floor. They were bright enough to cast shadows. We could hear nothing. No engine sounds, no rotors, nothing. One of the guys suggested we turn on our spotlights and signal to them. As soon as we did, all the lights shot straight up into the sky and vanished. It happened in seconds. One moment they were there, close enough that we could see they weren't orbs, but more like flattened discs. The next moment they were gone." The airmen reported experiencing radio interference during the encounter. Portable radios they were carrying crackled with static when the lights were close, then returned to normal function after the lights departed. Several of the men reported feeling disoriented and slightly nauseous, though these symptoms faded quickly. They did not file an official report with the Air Force. In 1953, reporting UFOs or unexplained phenomena could be career-ending for military personnel. The stigma attached to such claims was significant. But they did tell their families and eventually shared their experiences with civilian researchers decades later. This account, and others like it, fueled speculation that the military was conducting experiments in the Marfa area. The theory suggested that experimental aircraft, perhaps early versions of stealth technology or propulsion systems that would not become public knowledge for decades, were being tested in the desert under the cover of darkness. If people saw strange lights, those sightings could be attributed to the long-standing Marfa lights phenomenon. The pre-existing mystery provided perfect camouflage for classified operations. This theory gained traction when similar patterns emerged at other sites across the American Southwest. Strange lights in the sky were reported near Area 51 in Nevada, near the White Sands facility in New Mexico, and near various military bases in Arizona. In some cases, these lights were later revealed to be experimental aircraft. The U-2 spy plane, which flew at extreme altitudes and had unusual visual characteristics, was responsible for numerous UFO reports during the Cold War. The government had been using the vastness of the desert to test technologies in secret, knowing that any sightings would be dismissed as UFOs, natural phenomena, or optical illusions. Could the Marfa lights have served a similar purpose? Were some of the sightings during the 1950s, 60s and 70s legitimate tests of classified technology conducted in an area where strange lights had been seen for decades? The conspiracy angle here is not that all Marfa lights are military in origin, but that the pre-existing phenomenon provided convenient cover. If lights had been appearing in the desert for 70 years, who would question a few more? If locals were accustomed to seeing unexplained luminous phenomena, they would be less likely to report new sightings to authorities or demand investigations. The mystery itself became a security asset. Supporting this theory is the fact that the military never issued official statements about the Marfa lights, despite the presence of numerous installations in the region and despite the fact that military personnel were witnessing and reporting the phenomenon. The silence is conspicuous. If the lights were simply atmospheric refraction or natural phenomena, why not say so? If they were a concern, why not investigate? The lack of official attention suggests either complete indifference or deliberate avoidance. Another data point. Civilian pilots flying through the region during this era reported unusual phenomena. Several pilots filed reports with the Federal Aviation Administration describing lights that paced their aircraft, moved at speeds inconsistent with known technology, or performed maneuvers that defied aerodynamics. These reports were typically filed, acknowledged, and then quietly archived with no follow-up investigation. The military's relationship with the Marfa lights remains ambiguous. There is no smoking gun, no declassified document that confirms experimental aircraft were tested in the area using the pre-existing phenomenon as cover. But the correlation between increased military activity and changes in the light's behaviour, combined with the complete lack of official investigation or explanation, creates a pattern that conspiracy theorists find deeply suspicious. Whether or not the military was involved, the fact remains that during the mid-20th century, the character of the Marfa lights appeared to change, and that change coincided with an era of unprecedented secret military testing throughout the American Southwest. Chapter 6. The Lights That React 1. Of the most disturbing aspects of the Marfa lights is their apparent responsiveness to human presence and actions. This characteristic has been reported consistently across multiple decades by witnesses who had no contact with one another and no reason to coordinate their stories. The pattern is clear. When vehicles approach the location where lights are seen, the lights move away. When observers stop and watch, the lights change behaviour. When someone shines a flashlight, spotlight, or other light source toward the lights, they often dim, move away, or vanish entirely. This reactive behaviour has been documented by multiple witnesses simultaneously, ruling out individual misperception or hallucination. Groups of people, watching from the same location, have all observed the lights responding in the same way at the same time. Whatever the lights are, they behave in ways that suggest awareness, or at least responsiveness to external stimuli. One detailed account from 1976 describes a family's encounter with the lights. The family, visiting Marfa for a vacation, had heard about the phenomenon and drove out to the viewing area one evening. The father, an engineer named Richard Coleman, kept a detailed written account of what they experienced. According to Coleman's notes, they arrived at the viewing area around 8:30 in the evening. The sky was clear, the air was still, and they had excellent visibility. They waited for approximately 45 minutes, seeing nothing unusual. Then, around 9:15, lights appeared on the southern horizon. Coleman described them as orange-yellow spheres, approximately the size of basketballs if they were at the distance they appeared to be, which I estimated at 1 to 2 miles. There were initially 2 lights, hovering side by side about 30 feet apart. The family watched for several minutes. The lights remained stationary, glowing steadily. Then Coleman's teenage son suggested they try to get closer for a better look. They got back in their car and began driving south on a dirt road that led in the direction of the lights. As they drove, the lights moved. They began retreating as we advanced, Coleman wrote. They maintained what appeared to be a constant distance from us. When we accelerated, they moved faster. When we slowed down, they slowed down. It was as if they were aware of our presence and determined to stay out of reach. After driving for approximately 15 minutes, the family reached a point where the dirt road ended. They stopped the car and got out. The lights stopped moving and hovered in place about half a mile ahead, or so Coleman estimated. Coleman had brought a flashlight. On impulse, he pointed it toward the lights and flashed it 3 times. The lights immediately responded. They flashed 3 times in return, mimicking his signal. Startled, Coleman flashed 5 times. The lights flashed 5 times back. At this point, Coleman wrote, I felt genuine fear. These were not headlights or reflections. They were responding to us in real time, demonstrating awareness and intelligence. I called to my family to get back in the car. As we did, the lights split into 4 separate orbs, arranged themselves in a diamond formation, and then shot straight up into the sky at incredible speed. Within seconds, they were gone. The family returned to town shaken. Coleman later attempted to report the experience to local authorities, but was told that many people had seen the lights and there was nothing to investigate. He contacted the Air Force, thinking that if the lights were some kind of aircraft, the military should know about them. He received a polite letter thanking him for his report and assuring him that the matter would be looked into. He never heard anything further. Coleman's account is notable for several reasons. First, he was a trained engineer, accustomed to making precise observations and measurements. His description includes specific details about time, distance, and behaviour that suggest careful attention rather than exaggeration or fantasy. Second, his entire family witnessed the same events, providing multiple corroborating witnesses. Third, the light's response to his flashlight signals suggests not just awareness, but interactive capability, as if they were being controlled by something capable of recognising and mimicking patterns. This type of interactive behaviour has been reported multiple times. In 1989, a group of college students visiting Marfa attempted an experiment. They brought powerful spotlights and laser pointers, planning to see if they could interact with the lights. When lights appeared, they shined their spotlights directly at them. The lights immediately dimmed and moved away. When the students turned off their spotlights, the lights returned to their previous brightness and position. The students repeated this several times with consistent results. One member of the group later described the experience to a regional newspaper. It felt like we were playing with something intelligent. The lights weren't just moving randomly. They were responding to what we were doing in ways that seemed deliberate and purposeful. Another account from 2003 describes a couple who encountered the lights while driving at night on a remote highway south of Marfa. The lights appeared in front of their vehicle, hovering directly over the road. The driver slowed down, uncertain what to do. The lights descended lower, coming within what the driver estimated to be 50 feet of the car. The passenger reported feeling an overwhelming sense of unease, describing it as primal fear, the kind of fear you feel when you're being watched by a predator. The driver stopped the car. As soon as they came to a complete stop, the lights rose back up and moved off the road. The couple sat in their car for several minutes watching the lights hover in the desert. When they started driving again, the lights paced the vehicle for approximately 2 miles before veering off and disappearing. These accounts of reactive, seemingly intelligent behaviour cannot be easily explained by the atmospheric refraction theory. Refracted headlights do not respond to flashlight signals. Optical illusions do not change behaviour based on observer actions. If the lights were purely natural phenomena, or distant vehicle lights distorted by atmospheric conditions, they should not demonstrate any awareness of observers whatsoever. Skeptics argue that this apparent responsiveness is coincidental or misperceived. The lights may have been moving independently according to atmospheric conditions or other factors, and observers simply interpreted those movements as reactions. Human perception is pattern-seeking, and we often see intention and awareness where none actually exists. We anthropomorphize things, attributing human-like qualities to natural phenomena, but the sheer number of reports describing the same behaviour patterns makes coincidence difficult to accept. When multiple witnesses, separated by decades and unaware of each other's experiences, all describe lights that move away when approached, respond to light signals, and demonstrate apparent awareness of human presence, there is a pattern worth examining seriously. The conspiracy framing here is both simple and profoundly unsettling. Illusions do not react. Reflections do not demonstrate awareness. Atmospheric phenomena do not respond to stimuli. If the lights are responding to human presence in consistent, repeatable ways, then something with agency is involved. Whether that agency is natural intelligence we do not understand, artificial intelligence from human-made technology, or something else entirely remains an open question. But the evidence suggests the lights are not passive phenomena. They interact. They respond. They demonstrate behaviours that suggest purpose and awareness, and that makes them far more mysterious than any atmospheric explanation can account for. Chapter 7. Scientific Studies That End. Without conclusions, over the years, multiple universities, research institutions and independent scientists have attempted to study the Marfa lights using modern instruments and scientific methodology. Cameras, spectrometers, electromagnetic sensors, infrared detectors, radar systems and other sophisticated equipment have been deployed to the Marfa region to capture data during sightings and determine once and for all what causes this persistent phenomenon. The results have been frustratingly, mysteriously inconclusive. The first serious scientific study was conducted in 1973 by a team from the University of Texas at Austin. The research group included physicists, atmospheric scientists, and engineers. They spent 3 weeks in Marfa, setting up monitoring equipment at the traditional viewing area and at several other locations around the region. Their goal was to document the lights when they appeared and gather enough data to determine their cause. During the 3-week period, the team observed lights on 9 separate occasions. They captured them on photographic film, recorded electromagnetic readings, and measured temperature gradients in the atmosphere during sightings. Analysis of the data revealed several interesting facts. First, the lights emitted light primarily in the visible spectrum, with no unusual signatures in ultraviolet or infrared ranges. Second, electromagnetic sensors detected slight fluctuations during some sightings, but these fluctuations were inconsistent and did not correlate clearly with the appearance or behaviour of the lights. Third, temperature measurements showed atmospheric layering that could theoretically cause light refraction, but the degree of refraction observed did not fully account for the apparent positions and movements of the lights. The team published their findings in a technical journal, concluding, "The Marfa lights represent a genuine optical phenomenon. However, our data do not support a single unified explanation. While atmospheric refraction may account for some observed lights, several incidents recorded during our study period demonstrated characteristics inconsistent with refraction alone. Further research with more advanced instrumentation is recommended." A second study was conducted in 1987 by researchers from Texas Tech University. This team brought more advanced equipment, including computer-controlled cameras that could automatically track moving lights and more sensitive electromagnetic sensors. They spent 4 weeks in the area during spring, chosen because local residents reported that spring and fall were the most active periods for light sightings. The 1987 study produced even more puzzling results. The team documented 13 separate incidents of unexplained lights. In 7 of those incidents, analysis suggested the lights could be explained by vehicle headlights refracted through atmospheric layers. But in 6 incidents, the lights demonstrated behaviours that the team could not explain using the refraction model. One incident in particular troubled the researchers. Multiple lights appeared and arranged themselves in a geometric pattern, a hexagon with 6 orbs evenly spaced. This formation held for approximately 8 minutes. Then the lights merged into a single bright orb that ascended vertically and vanished. The team's instruments showed no atmospheric conditions that would explain such behaviour. No vehicles were visible in the area where the lights appeared. Radar detected no aircraft. The lead researcher, a physicist named Dr. Thomas Harrington, was quoted in a newspaper interview. "We came to Marfa expecting to solve this mystery definitively. We brought the best equipment available and a team of trained observers. What we found was more complex than we anticipated. Some sightings fit known explanations, others do not. The phenomenon appears to have multiple causes, and we have not identified all of them." The 1987 study ended when funding ran out. The team had planned to continue their research for an additional 2 months, but the grant that supported their work was not renewed. No official reason was given for the funding withdrawal. A third major study was attempted in 1998 by an independent research group funded by private donors. This study aimed to use cutting-edge technology including infrared imaging systems, spectrographic analysis equipment, and computer modelling to analyse the lights in unprecedented detail. The group set up a permanent monitoring station on private land south of Marfa, with equipment running 24 hours a day. For 6 months, the station captured data continuously. During that period, the automated systems detected and recorded 23 incidents of unusual lights. Analysis of the data produced a pattern that the researchers found deeply frustrating. Some nights, the lights appeared and behaved exactly as the atmospheric refraction theory would predict, matching known vehicle positions and movements with the observed light phenomena. Other nights, lights appeared with no corresponding vehicle traffic, moved in ways inconsistent with refraction, or demonstrated characteristics that the team could not explain. The study also revealed something unusual. On nights when unexplained lights appeared, the electromagnetic readings were consistently different from nights when explainable lights appeared. The team detected low-frequency electromagnetic pulses correlated with the unexplained lights, pulses that did not occur during nights when the lights could be attributed to headlight refraction. These electromagnetic pulses were similar to those detected in geological areas experiencing tectonic stress. The team hypothesized that geological activity beneath the Marfa region might be generating electromagnetic fields, and these fields might be creating luminous effects through a process called earthquake lights or tectonic luminosity. But this explanation raised as many questions as it answered. If geological stress was causing the lights, why were they localized to such a specific area? Why did they appear sporadically rather than correlating with seismic activity? And why did historical accounts dating back to the 1880s describe lights behaving in the same ways as modern sightings, despite the fact that any geological stress should be slowly changing over time? The 1998 study concluded with a statement that echoes previous research. Our data confirm that the Marfa lights are real and observable. Multiple causal factors appear to be at work. Some sightings are explained by atmospheric refraction of vehicle lights. Others may be caused by tectonic-related luminosity. A small percentage of sightings remained unexplained despite extensive instrumentation and analysis. Continued long-term monitoring is recommended. Continued long-term monitoring was never established. The private funding that supported the study was withdrawn after 6 months. The monitoring station was dismantled. The equipment was removed. The data was archived but never fully analysed or published in peer-reviewed journals. This pattern has repeated itself multiple times over the past 50 years. Research teams arrive with plans for comprehensive studies. They gather some data, encounter phenomena they cannot fully explain, publish preliminary findings suggesting further research is needed, and then the projects end due to lack of funding or institutional support. The official conclusion, when one is given at all, is always the same: inconclusive. For conspiracy theorists, this pattern is deeply suspicious. Why do scientific studies consistently fail to reach clear conclusions? Why does funding disappear just as research begins to yield interesting data? Why is there so little institutional interest in a phenomenon that has been documented for over a century and continues to be witnessed regularly? Several possible explanations present themselves. One is that the truth is already known, but it cannot be publicly disclosed. Perhaps the lights are a mixture of natural phenomena and classified military activity. Perhaps some sightings are genuine atmospheric effects, while others are tests of exotic technology. Revealing the full explanation would require admitting to secret operations conducted in the area for decades. It's easier to allow the mystery to persist, to fund just enough research to seem interested, but not enough to reach definitive conclusions. Another possibility is that the lights genuinely defy current scientific understanding, and no one wants to admit that. In an era when science is expected to provide answers to all questions, admitting that a simple observable phenomenon has resisted explanation for over a century would be embarrassing. It would suggest that our understanding of atmospheric physics, geology, or even fundamental physics might be incomplete. It's easier to label the phenomenon as inconclusive and move on to research questions that can be answered. A third possibility is more cynical. There is no conspiracy, just the mundane reality of how scientific research operates. Studying the Marfa lights does not advance careers. It does not lead to groundbreaking discoveries or prestigious publications. It's a backwater topic that mainstream science views as barely above studying UFOs or Bigfoot. Funding agencies allocate money to research that promises clear results and scientific advancement. A mystery that has resisted explanation for over a century is not appealing to them. The lack of continued research is not evidence of conspiracy, but evidence of institutional priorities that favour predictable outcomes over genuine mysteries. Whatever the reason, the fact remains. Despite modern technology, sophisticated instruments, and multiple scientific studies spanning 50 years, the Marfa lights remain unexplained. Some sightings fit known causes, others do not, and the phenomenon continues, night after night, year after year, as persistent and mysterious as it was when Robert Reed Ellison first saw it in 1883. Chapter 8. The Interdimensional Theory. When conventional explanations fail repeatedly, when scientific studies end without definitive conclusions, when phenomena resist categorization, despite sophisticated technology and rigorous inquiry, alternative theories inevitably emerge. In the case of the Marfa lights, one of the most intriguing and most speculative theories is what researchers call the interdimensional hypothesis. This theory proposes that the Marfa region occupies a unique position in terms of physical reality, a location where the normal laws of physics behave slightly differently than they do elsewhere. Geological stress from tectonic activity, unusual mineral compositions in the bedrock, electromagnetic anomalies from underground structures, or some combination of these factors may create conditions that allow energy or matter from other dimensions to briefly manifest in our observable reality. The concept sounds like science fiction, but it draws on legitimate theoretical physics. Modern physics, particularly quantum mechanics and string theory, proposes the existence of additional dimensions beyond the three spatial dimensions, and one time dimension we experience directly. These additional dimensions are typically described as compactified or curled up, at scales too small to observe directly. But theoretical models suggest that under certain conditions, effects from these hidden dimensions might become visible, or at least detectable. The interdimensional theory of the Marfa lights suggests that the geological and electromagnetic conditions in this specific region of West Texas create a weak point or boundary zone where the barrier between dimensions becomes thin. Energy from elsewhere, perhaps from a parallel reality, or from dimensional structures we cannot normally perceive, briefly leaks through into our dimension, manifesting as visible light. According to this theory, the lights are not objects in the traditional sense. They are not spacecraft, not drones, not vehicles of any kind. They are not ball lightning or atmospheric plasma or refracted headlights. They are manifestations, brief intersections between our world and something else, moments when energy that exists primarily in dimensions we cannot access becomes visible to us. This would explain several puzzling aspects of the phenomenon. It would explain why the lights appear sporadically rather than on a predictable schedule. The conditions required for such an interdimensional opening would be rare and unpredictable, depending on complex interactions between geological, stress, electromagnetic fields, and perhaps factors we haven't identified. It would explain why the lights sometimes seem to react to observers. If they are manifestations of energy from dimensions where our physical laws don't fully apply, they might respond to electromagnetic fields generated by human technology, or even by human consciousness itself, in ways that seem intelligent, but are actually just following physical laws we don't understand. It would explain why the lights vanish when approached. They are not moving away in three-dimensional space. They are ceasing to manifest in our dimension, the conditions required for their appearance no longer being met once observers get too close or introduce electromagnetic interference from vehicles and equipment. It would explain why scientific instruments sometimes detect unusual electromagnetic readings during sightings, but cannot consistently replicate results. The phenomenon itself is not stable or permanent. Each manifestation may be slightly different depending on the precise configuration of geological, electromagnetic, and perhaps other factors at that specific moment. Most importantly, the interdimensional theory explains why the lights are geographically localized. They appear in the Marfa region because the conditions required for manifestation exist specifically there. The unique combination of geology, electromagnetic characteristics, and perhaps other factors has created a location where the dimensional boundary is consistently weak enough for energy from elsewhere to occasionally break through. Proponents of this theory point to similar phenomena reported worldwide. In Norway, the Hessdalen lights have been documented and studied for decades, exhibiting behaviour strikingly similar to the Marfa lights. The Norwegian government has funded long-term research into the Hessdalen phenomenon, establishing a permanent monitoring station that has been operating since the 1980s. The data gathered, there shows unexplained lights that appear sporadically, move in unusual ways, and resist conventional explanation. The region where the Hessdalen lights appear sits atop unusual geology, including deposits of scandium and other rare minerals that create complex electromagnetic environments. In Japan, the Naga fireballs appear annually over the Mekong River during a specific time of year. These luminous spheres rise from the water and ascend into the sky, witnessed by thousands of people. Various explanations have been proposed, including fermentation gases igniting, but none fully account for the observed behaviour. The river flows through a region with complex geological structures and high mineral content. In North Carolina, the Brown Mountain Lights have been observed since at least the early 19th century. Like the Marfa lights, they appear as glowing orbs that move through the air, split into multiples and vanish mysteriously. The region where they appear sits along geological fault lines and contains unusual mineral deposits. All of these phenomena share common traits: unexplained luminescence, erratic movement that sometimes seems purposeful, resistance to conventional explanation, and a strong connection to specific geographical locations with unusual geological characteristics. If these lights are interdimensional manifestations, it would explain why they remain localized. The specific conditions required for the phenomenon exist only in certain places on Earth, where geology, electromagnetic fields, and possibly other factors combine in precisely the right way. The interdimensional theory also connects to documented historical accounts of strange lights and apparitions associated with specific locations. Ancient peoples often considered certain sites sacred or haunted, places where the normal rules did not fully apply, where spirits or gods could appear. Many of these sites correspond to locations with unusual geological features: mineral, deposits, fault lines, underground water sources, or unusual magnetic anomalies. Could these ancient peoples have been observing the same interdimensional phenomena we now call the Marfa lights, or Hessdalen lights? Were they interpreting these manifestations through the framework of their spiritual beliefs, while we attempt to understand them through science? Critics of the interdimensional theory argue that it relies on unproven physics, and ventures too far into speculation. While additional dimensions may exist in theoretical models, there is no experimental evidence that energy from those dimensions can manifest as visible light in our reality. The theory requires accepting extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. They also point out that the theory is unfalsifiable. If the lights are claimed to be interdimensional manifestations, there is no experiment that can definitively prove or disprove that claim. Science requires hypotheses that can be tested and potentially falsified. The interdimensional theory does not meet that standard. But for those who have witnessed the lights firsthand, who have watched them perform movements that defy rational explanation, who have experienced the strange reactive behaviour documented by so many witnesses, the interdimensional theory offers a framework that fits the evidence better than any alternative. It does not require dismissing historical sightings as misidentifications. It does not require assuming witnesses were mistaken or dishonest. It does not require ignoring the reactive, seemingly intelligent behaviour the lights sometimes display. It simply requires accepting that our current understanding of physics and reality may be incomplete, that there may be aspects of the universe we have not yet discovered, and that certain locations on Earth may provide windows, however brief and unstable, into dimensions beyond our normal perception. Whether the interdimensional theory is correct remains an open question, but it represents a serious attempt to account for all aspects of the phenomenon, rather than explaining some sightings while dismissing others, and in that sense it deserves consideration, even if it challenges our conventional understanding of how reality works. Chapter 9. Why the Lights Never Leave. One of the most unusual and telling aspects of the Marfa lights is their geographic consistency. Over more than a century of documented sightings, the lights have remained bound to a specific region of West Texas. Unlike UFO sightings, which can occur anywhere and often involve objects that travel great distances or appear in wildly different locations, the Marfa lights stay home. They appear in the same general area, night after night, year after year, decade after decade. They do not travel beyond their established territory. They do not appear in El Paso, 200 miles to the west, or in San Antonio, 300 miles to the east. They do not show up in other states or other countries. They are tied to this specific stretch of desert as if bound by invisible borders or physical constraints. This localization is scientifically significant. If the lights were aircraft or drones, whether conventional or exotic, they would not be confined to a single area. Aircraft can travel anywhere. Drones can be operated anywhere. There is no technological reason why mysterious flying objects would restrict themselves to a few square miles of West Texas desert. If the lights were purely atmospheric phenomena, similar conditions should produce similar results elsewhere. Texas has thousands of miles of desert with similar geology, elevation, and climate. New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and California all have vast desert regions where atmospheric refraction should occur just as readily as it does near Marfa. Yet none of these regions reports persistent light phenomena matching the behaviour and consistency of the Marfa lights. The fact that the lights remain localised suggests that whatever causes them is tied to something specific about this location. The phenomenon is not mobile. It cannot be relocated or replicated elsewhere. This points toward a geological or geographical cause, something inherent to the Marfa region itself. Researchers have examined the geology of the area extensively. The Marfa region sits at approximately 4,800 feet elevation on a high desert plateau. The underlying geology includes layers of limestone, sandstone, and volcanic rock deposited over millions of years. Several fault lines run through the region, evidence of ongoing tectonic activity, though the area does not experience frequent earthquakes. The region contains deposits of various minerals including copper, silver, and rare earth elements. Some researchers have suggested these mineral deposits might create electromagnetic anomalies that contribute to light phenomena. Others have proposed that underground water flowing through limestone caverns could generate piezoelectric effects as pressure changes stress the rock. But none of these geological features are unique to Marfa. Similar geology exists throughout West Texas and the broader Southwest. Yet the persistent, documented light phenomena remain localized to this specific area. The conspiracy framing here is that whatever causes the lights is tied to the land itself, but the specific mechanism remains unknown or is being deliberately concealed. What exists beneath the Marfa Desert that creates these conditions? What makes this location special when similar geography elsewhere does not produce similar effects? Some researchers have suggested the presence of significant underground cavern systems that have not been fully mapped or explored. Large caverns could create unique acoustic and electromagnetic environments, potentially generating piezoelectric or triboluminescent effects, as geological stress causes rock surfaces to shift and grind against one another. The lights could be natural electrical discharges from this subsurface activity, manifesting as visible luminescence when they reach the surface. This theory is plausible and grounded in known physics. Earthquake lights, a documented phenomenon, occur when stressed rock generates electrical charges that discharge as visible light. This has been observed before, during, and after seismic events in various parts of the world. Perhaps the Marfa region experiences continuous low-level tectonic stress that generates similar effects without producing noticeable earthquakes. But earthquake lights typically appear directly above the stressed geological structures, whereas the Marfa lights appear to move horizontally across the desert and rise vertically into the air. They split into multiple sources and merge back together, behaviours not easily explained by static electrical discharge from stressed rock. Other researchers point to the region's position relative to larger geological structures. The Marfa region lies between two major geological provinces, the Basin and Range province to the west and the Great Plains province to the east. This boundary zone may create unique conditions as different geological structures interact. Still others propose that ancient sites in the region, places where indigenous peoples once gathered, conducted rituals, or marked as sacred, might correspond to locations where unusual natural phenomena occur. Indigenous peoples lived in harmony with their environment for thousands of years. They understood patterns in nature that modern settlers often missed. If certain locations consistently produce strange lights or other unusual phenomena, Indigenous peoples would have noticed and incorporated these observations into their spiritual frameworks. The Apache and Comanche peoples who inhabited this region before European settlement have oral traditions speaking of spirit lights that appear in the desert, lights that are neither entirely of this world nor entirely supernatural, but something in between. These traditions describe lights that appear when conditions are right, lights that should be observed but not approached, lights that carry messages or warnings from the spirit world. Modern researchers attempting to map traditional indigenous sacred sites have found that several correspond to locations where the Marfa lights are most frequently observed. This correlation could be coincidental, or it could suggest that indigenous peoples recognise something about these locations that we are only now beginning to understand through scientific inquiry. The permanence of the lights, their refusal to relocate or diminish over time, makes them more unsettling than transient phenomena. A mysterious object that flies away can be forgotten, rationalised, or dismissed as a one-time anomaly. But lights that return, year after year, century after century, in the same place, cannot be so easily ignored. They demand explanation, and they refuse to provide one. This persistence also raises questions about what will happen in the future. Will the lights continue indefinitely? Is there any reason to believe they might stop? If they are caused by geological processes, those processes operate on timescales measured in millions of years. The lights that Robert Reed Ellison saw in 1883 might continue appearing for thousands of years to come. Or perhaps the phenomenon is gradually changing in ways too subtle for us to notice over human lifetimes. Perhaps the lights appeared more frequently 1,000 years ago, or perhaps they appear more frequently now. Without continuous records spanning centuries, we cannot know if the phenomenon is stable or evolving. What we do know is that the lights have remained in the same location for at least 143 years of documented history, and likely far longer based on indigenous oral traditions. They are residents, not visitors. They have always been there, part of the landscape, part of the desert, as permanent as the mountains on the horizon, and they will continue to be there long after we're gone, glowing in the darkness, performing their mysterious dance, offering no explanations and accepting no interpretation. They simply are, and perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. Chapter 10. Why no one shuts the story down. Perhaps the most telling aspect of the Marfa lights phenomenon is not the lights themselves, but the official response to them, or rather, the conspicuous lack thereof. For a mystery that has been documented for over a century, witnessed by thousands of people, featured in news reports and scientific studies, and continues actively to this day, the absence of comprehensive official investigation is remarkable. Authorities do not deny the lights exist. There are too many witnesses, too much documentation, and too much public awareness for denial to be credible. The lights appear in tourist brochures. The town has an official viewing area. Local law enforcement officers admit to seeing them personally. Denial is not an option. But authorities do not confirm anything unusual either. The official stance, to the extent there is one, is quiet acknowledgement without investigation. Yes, people see lights. Yes, they have been seen for a long time. No, we do not know exactly what causes them. Perhaps refracted headlights, perhaps atmospheric effects, and that is as far as official commentary goes. Local law enforcement does not investigate the lights. When witnesses report sightings, the response is polite acknowledgement. Officers do not drive out to investigate. They do not file reports. They do not escalate concerns to state authorities. The lights are simply accepted as part of the landscape, unusual but not worth active investigation. State officials do not demand studies or create task forces. Texas has government agencies responsible for natural resources, environmental protection and scientific research. None of these agencies has launched comprehensive studies of the Marfa lights. No state funding has been allocated specifically to investigate the phenomenon. No official state position exists. Federal agencies show even less interest. The Federal Aviation Administration has received reports of unusual lights in the Marfa region from civilian and commercial pilots, but has not investigated. The Department of Defense, despite significant military presence in West Texas during the 20th century and despite the light's proximity to military installation approaches, has never issued statements or conducted declassified investigations. The Department of Energy, which handles research into geological phenomena including potential energy resources, has not studied the Marfa region specifically regarding the lights. This passive approach is unusual, perhaps even unique, in the landscape of unexplained American phenomena. In a country where unexplained phenomena typically trigger responses ranging from government investigation to military involvement to public scientific inquiry, the Marfa lights have been left almost entirely alone. Compare the official response to the Marfa lights with responses to other mysterious phenomena. When unexplained aerial objects were reported near military installations during the Cold War, the Air Force created Project Blue Book, a systematic investigation lasting decades. When unusual radar returns were detected over Washington, D.C. in 1952, fighter jets were scrambled and official inquiries were launched. When strange lights appeared near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, military personnel were immediately dispatched and official statements were issued. But with the Marfa lights, nothing. No Project Blue Book investigation, no military deployment, no official inquiries, just quiet tolerance of an ongoing mystery that, by any reasonable standard, should warrant at least basic scientific investigation. Why? Several possible explanations present themselves, each with different implications for what the lights actually are and what authorities actually know about them. Explanation 1. The truth is known but cannot be disclosed. This is the classic conspiracy theory interpretation. Perhaps authorities, particularly military and intelligence agencies, know exactly what the Marfa lights are. Perhaps some of the lights are natural phenomena, but others are tests of classified technology conducted under the cover of the pre-existing mystery. Perhaps experimental propulsion systems, drone technologies, or directed energy weapons have been tested in the Marfa region, specifically because sightings there could be attributed to the long-standing light phenomenon. If this is the case, official investigation would be counterproductive. It would draw attention to activities that are meant to remain classified. Better to allow the mystery to persist, to let civilians believe the lights are either atmospheric effects or supernatural phenomena, anything except classified military testing. Supporting this interpretation is the timing of certain changes in the light's behaviour. As noted earlier, witnesses during the Cold War era reported lights that moved in more controlled, purposeful ways than earlier accounts suggest. Formation flying, angular movements, rapid acceleration, controlled hovering. These behaviours appeared in reports from the 1950s through the 1970s, exactly the period when classified aircraft and weapons testing was at its peak in the American Southwest. The lack of official investigation during this period makes sense. If authorities already knew some sightings were their own classified programs, investigating would only risk exposing those programs. Explanation 2. The truth is unknown and embarrassing. An alternative interpretation is that authorities genuinely do not know what the lights are, and that ignorance is embarrassing enough, that active investigation is avoided. In an era when science is expected to provide answers to all questions, admitting that a simple observable phenomenon has resisted explanation for over a century would undermine public confidence in scientific and governmental competence. Better to quietly acknowledge the mystery without investigating thoroughly. If no serious investigation is conducted, no definitive failure to explain can be documented. The phenomenon can be treated as a quirky local legend, interesting but not important enough to warrant serious resources. This interpretation suggests incompetence or institutional inertia rather than active conspiracy. Agencies that could investigate simply choose not to because the lights do not pose an obvious threat, and investigating mysteries is not a priority. Budgets are allocated to research that promises clear results and practical applications. Studying lights in the desert that might be atmospheric effects might be something else, and definitely have no immediate economic or security implications is not appealing to funding agencies or government departments focused on concrete deliverables. Explanation 3. The truth is being deliberately ignored. A third possibility combines elements of the first two. Perhaps some authorities know something about the lights, perhaps connected to past classified testing, but current authorities do not have complete information. Perhaps records were lost, classified beyond retrieval, or simply never properly documented in the first place. Perhaps knowledge of what the lights are exists in fragments scattered across different agencies and different classification levels, with no single person or department having complete understanding. In this scenario, investigation is avoided not because authorities know the truth and are hiding it, but because investigation would reveal uncomfortable questions about past activities and might expose classification failures or institutional dysfunction. It's easier to leave the mystery alone than to open archives and potentially discover that previous administrations conducted activities that would be controversial if revealed. Explanation 4. The truth is less interesting than the mystery. A fourth, more cynical interpretation is that authorities know some sightings are explained by atmospheric refraction and others by natural geological phenomena, but revealing these explanations in detail would reduce tourism and local economic activity generated by the mystery. The Marfa lights bring visitors to a small town that would otherwise have little reason to attract tourists. Those visitors support local businesses. In this interpretation, a quiet understanding exists between local and state authorities. Do not investigate too thoroughly, because solving the mystery completely would harm the town economically. Allow the mystery to persist as a tourist attraction while maintaining enough scientific credibility to prevent the phenomenon from being entirely dismissed. This interpretation requires believing that economic interests outweigh scientific curiosity, which is cynical but not unrealistic. Small towns throughout America maintain mysteries and legends that support tourism. Deliberate hoaxes are one thing, but choosing not to definitively solve an authentic mystery because the mystery itself has economic value is entirely plausible. The most unsettling possibility. But there is a fifth interpretation, perhaps the most unsettling of all. Perhaps the lights have not been officially investigated because they cannot be. Perhaps previous attempts at thorough investigation encountered phenomena that defied not just explanation, but even proper documentation. Perhaps the lights, when studied closely with serious intent, refuse to appear or behave in ways that prevent meaningful data collection. This interpretation suggests the phenomenon itself resists investigation, as if whatever causes it only manifests, when observers maintain a certain distance or approach with a certain attitude. Scientists arriving with equipment and intention to measure and categorize find nothing. Casual observers watching without expectation see vivid displays. If this is the case, official investigation would be futile. Authorities may have attempted serious study, achieved no results, and quietly concluded that resources are better spent elsewhere. The lack of public investigation is not conspiracy, but pragmatic acceptance that the phenomenon cannot be studied using conventional methods. Supporting this interpretation are the numerous scientific studies that yielded inconclusive results, that gathered some data but could not develop comprehensive explanations, that captured phenomena on some nights but not others, with no clear pattern determining success or failure. Whatever the true explanation for the lack of official investigation, the result is the same. The Marfa lights continue to appear. People continue to watch. No official explanation is forthcoming, and the mystery persists, neither embraced nor debunked, quietly tolerated by authorities who either know more than they say or know less than they should. The silence itself becomes evidence, though of what remains unclear. Are we being protected from knowledge we cannot handle? Are we being kept ignorant of classified programs? Are we being allowed to enjoy a mystery that has economic value? Or are we simply witnessing the indifference of bureaucratic systems that see no compelling reason to investigate lights in the desert? The answer likely involves all of these factors in different proportions. But the pattern is undeniable. For over a century, mysterious lights have appeared in the West Texas desert. Thousands of witnesses have observed them. Multiple scientific studies have documented them, and official authorities have done essentially nothing in response. That inaction, that studied indifference, that careful maintenance of ambiguity without commitment may tell us more about the nature of the phenomenon than any investigation ever could. Epilogue. The desert still watches. Back on clear nights, people still gather along the viewing area south of Marfa, at the place where generations before them have stood watching the desert, waiting for lights that may or may not appear. They bring folding chairs and blankets, thermoses of coffee against the desert cold, cameras and phones hoping to capture something that has resisted documentation for over a century. They park their cars facing south, toward the mountains that form a jagged horizon in the distance. They wait as darkness falls completely, as the stars emerge in their thousands, as the Milky Way arches overhead in a display that would have been commonplace a century ago, but is now rare enough that many visitors see it for the first time here. And they watch. Sometimes the lights appear. Soft orbs of luminescence rise from the darkness, yellow, orange or white, glowing steadily at first, then beginning to move. They drift horizontally across the desert floor or rise vertically into the air. They split into multiple sources that maintain formation for minutes at a time before merging back together. They perform their ancient dance, the same dance witnessed by Robert Reed Ellison in 1883, the same dance described by railroad workers and ranchers, and sheriff's deputies and teachers across more than a century of history. Witnesses watch in silence, or in whispered conversation. Some feel wonder, some feel unease, many feel both. They capture shaky videos on their phones, knowing even as they do that the videos will show lights but will convey nothing of the experience of watching them, of feeling the desert cold and the immense silence and the peculiar sensation that something beyond normal understanding is occurring just beyond reach. Sometimes nothing appears. The desert remains dark and still, showing only the distant lights of ranches and the occasional vehicle far away on Highway 67. People wait for hours, scanning the horizon with binoculars and hope, until eventually they pack up and leave, wondering if they will ever see what others have seen, wondering if the lights choose who witnesses them and who does not. The Marfa lights do not care whether they are witnessed or not. They do not perform on demand. They are not entertainment or confirmation or revelation. They appear when conditions are right, or when they choose to, or when the universe aligns in ways we do not understand. They exist independent of human observation, indifferent to human theories, unmoved by human curiosity or frustration. Robert Reed Ellison saw the lights in 1883, riding alone in a darkness more complete than most people today will ever experience. He saw something that troubled him enough that he remembered it for the rest of his life, something that made him question what he thought he knew about the world. People are seeing them tonight, watching from the viewing area or from back roads, witnesses to the same phenomenon that has played out across 3 centuries. And unless something fundamental changes, people will see them decades from now, long after we're gone. The lights remain, the questions remain, and the desert watches back, holding its secrets beneath a sky that knows far more than it will ever tell. Scientists have proposed theories, conspiracy theorists have offered interpretations, authorities have maintained their silence. But the lights themselves continue, neither confirmed nor denied, neither fully explained nor completely mysterious. They occupy a space between the known and the unknown, between the natural and the inexplicable, between what science tells us is possible and what our eyes insist we have seen. Perhaps that is where they belong. Perhaps some phenomena exist specifically to remind us that reality is larger than our understanding of it, that the world contains mysteries that resist resolution, that there are things we witness but cannot explain, and places where the normal rules seem not to fully apply. The Marfa lights are not unique in this regard. Similar phenomena occur in other places, other lights in other deserts and mountains and valleys, other locations where witnesses describe experiences that match no available explanation. But the Marfa lights are perhaps the most thoroughly documented, the most consistently observed, and the most persistently unexplained. They have survived attempts at debunking. They have outlasted scientific studies. They have weathered decades of skepticism and centuries of observation. They appear to the believer and the skeptic alike, caring nothing for what we think of them. And they will continue long after the last person reading these words is gone, long after Marfa itself is forgotten, long after whatever civilization currently inhabits this planet has passed into history. The lights, if they are indeed tied to the land itself, to geological processes operating on timescales measured in millions of years, will persist until the very rocks beneath the desert are worn away to nothing. That is the final unsettling truth about the Marfa lights. They are not a mystery we will solve. They are not a phenomenon we will explain away or definitively prove. They are a permanent reminder that despite all our technology and all our scientific advancement, despite our instruments and our theories and our absolute confidence in our ability to understand the natural world, some things remain beyond us. The lights are still there, the desert still watches, and somewhere between the mountains and the stars, between the known and the unknown, between what we can explain and what we can only witness, the Marfa lights continue their dance, exactly as they have for longer than anyone knows, exactly as they will for longer than anyone can imagine. Thank you for listening. Before we begin tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and we're incredibly grateful for your support. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. Now let's dive into tonight's story. A massive thank you to Know Thyself for suggesting tonight's investigation. This one goes deep. Project Bluebeam. The activation file. There are conspiracy theories, and then there are conspiracy theories built on foundations so solid, so verifiable, that calling them theories starts to feel uncomfortable. What you're about to hear isn't fiction dressed up as fact. It's fact dressed up as something we desperately want to remain fiction. In January of the year following the most divisive election in modern American history, a reporter in Montreal opened a box that had been sitting in a storage unit for 20 years. Inside that box was evidence of a program that, according to official records, never existed. According to the people who worked on it, it was never supposed to be discovered, and according to the timeline documented within those papers, it was already too late to stop what was coming. This is the story of Project Bluebeam, not the internet legend, not the wild speculation, the documented version, the one with names, dates, programs and technology that all check out when you start pulling the threads, the one that makes you wonder why we were ever allowed to know about it at all. Part 1. The file that shouldn't exist. Daniel Rousseau wasn't looking for a conspiracy when he inherited the box. He was a local news reporter for a small independent paper in Montreal, the kind of journalist who covered city council meetings and restaurant openings. At 38 years old, he'd long ago abandoned the idealistic dreams of investigative journalism that had driven him in his 20s. He paid his bills, wrote his assigned stories, and went home to his apartment overlooking Rue Saint-Denis. His Aunt Claire had passed away in late December, just after Christmas. She'd been his favourite relative growing up, a librarian with an endless curiosity about the world and a habit of collecting things. Books, mostly, but also letters, documents, photographs. Her apartment had been a museum of other people's lives, carefully catalogued and preserved. The estate lawyer had called Daniel on a cold January morning. Most of Claire's possessions were being donated or divided among other family members, but there was one item she'd specifically left to him in her will, a locked metal container that she'd been storing for a colleague who died 2 decades earlier. The will stipulated that the box was to be opened only by Daniel, and only after her death. Daniel picked up the box on a Tuesday afternoon. It was heavier than he expected, roughly the size of a small filing cabinet, made of grey steel with a combination lock that had rusted at the edges. The lawyer handed him an envelope containing the combination written in his aunt's precise handwriting. He brought it home in the back of his car, struggling to carry it up 3 flights of stairs to his apartment. He set it on his kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before opening the envelope. The combination was simple, 4 numbers, each representing a year. He spun the dial carefully, feeling the mechanism click into place. When he lifted the lid, the smell of old paper and dust filled his small kitchen. Inside were documents, stacks of them. But these weren't the personal letters or family records he'd expected. These were official documents, NASA internal memos on official letterhead, photocopied budget reports with classification stamps, technical diagrams covered in handwritten notes, dates ranging from the beginning of the final decade of the Cold War through the middle of the 90s. And sitting on top of everything else, carefully wrapped in plastic, was a VHS tape in a faded case with a single label written in black marker. Bluebeam, Phase 3. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the tape. The plastic case was yellowed with age, the label faded but still legible. Underneath the title, someone had written a date in smaller script. June of the year before the bicentennial of American independence, 27 years ago. He set the tape aside and began removing the documents, spreading them across his kitchen table in careful piles. Manila folders, some stamped with official-looking headers, loose pages covered in technical jargon, photographs of equipment he didn't recognize, and throughout everything, names he did recognize. One folder caught his attention immediately. The tab read, SDI Star Wars, Atmospheric Projection Division, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, Ronald Reagan's space-based missile defense program. That was real. That was documented history. Daniel had written a piece about the 40th anniversary of its announcement just a few years ago. But atmospheric projection, that wasn't in any of the public records he'd seen. That wasn't in any of the declassified documents about Star Wars. He opened the folder carefully. Inside were memos, technical specifications, and what appeared to be progress reports from various testing facilities. White Sands Missile Range, Kirtland Air Force Base, even a facility in Alaska he'd never heard of. Then he found the note. It was paper-clipped to a faded photocopy of what looked like a satellite trajectory chart. The paper was lined, torn from a notebook, covered in the same handwriting as the tape label. If this reaches you, Phase 1 has already begun. They've spent 30 years perfecting the technology, another 20, integrating it into the infrastructure. By the time you read this, the sky itself will be a weapon, and nobody will know the difference between what's real and what's projected. I tried to warn them. They made sure nobody listened. Don't make the same mistake. Document everything, verify everything, and understand that exposure doesn't stop this. It only confirms that the program has moved beyond the point where exposure matters. SM. The initials at the bottom made Daniel's stomach tighten. SM. He pulled out his laptop and searched for the name he suspected. Within seconds he had confirmation. Serge Monast, investigative journalist, born in Quebec, died in his Montreal apartment in December of the year the Olympic Games came to Atlanta. Cause of death, heart attack. Age, 46. No autopsy was performed at the request of his family, but that wasn't what made Daniel's hands shake as he read the Wikipedia entry. It was what Monast had been investigating before his death. In the mid-90s, Monast had published a series of explosive claims about a NASA-led psychological operation designed to establish a new world order through the use of advanced holographic technology. He called it Project Bluebeam. He claimed it had 4 phases: the breakdown of archaeological knowledge, a global show of holograms to simulate religious events, telepathic electronic two-way communication, and universal supernatural manifestations using electronic means. The claims were dismissed immediately. Labelled paranoid, conspiracy theorist drivel, Monas was mocked in the press, his credibility destroyed. Some articles suggested he'd had a mental breakdown. Others implied he was a grifter trying to sell books. Then he died. Suddenly. Unexpectedly. At 46 years old. And his research had ended up in Claire's storage locker, locked away for 20 years, waiting for someone to open it. Daniel looked at the documents spread across his table. The official letterhead, the classification stamps, the technical diagrams. This wasn't the work of a madman. This was evidence of something real. He made a pot of coffee. He called in sick to work. He turned off his phone. And he started reading. The first memo was dated July of the year the Berlin Wall still stood. It was addressed to someone whose name had been redacted, from someone else whose name had also been blacked out. But the subject line was clear. Feasibility assessment. Large-scale atmospheric visual projection for strategic deception operations. The memo was dense with technical language, but the core concept was simple. Using lasers, satellite arrays, and atmospheric manipulation to create visual phenomena in the sky that could be seen by large populations. The applications listed were all defensive, creating false missile trails to confuse enemy tracking systems, generating decoy aircraft to waste enemy ammunition, projecting images of military assets in locations where none existed. But buried in the third paragraph was a line that made Daniel stop. Secondary applications in domestic psychological operations remain theoretical, but promising. Initial simulations suggest population response to unexplained aerial phenomena follows predictable patterns that could be leveraged for narrative control and social conditioning. Daniel read it 3 times. Narrative control, social conditioning. Those weren't military terms. Those were intelligence terms, psychological operations terms. He kept reading. The next document was a budget allocation from the year the Challenger exploded. It showed funding for something called the Theoretical Event Projection Unit within NASA. The budget was modest, only a few million, but it was designated for advanced research in atmospheric manipulation and large-scale visual stimulation technologies. Then came a technical report from White Sands Missile Range, dated June of that same year. The report detailed a successful test of ground-based coherent light projection, creating a visual image in the sky that was visible from 15 miles away. The image had lasted for approximately 3 minutes before dispersing. Witnesses from nearby towns had reported seeing strange lights, but no official explanation had been provided. The report concluded with a recommendation. Technology shows significant promise for operational deployment. Recommend expanded testing with larger arrays and longer duration trials. Suggest coordination with ionospheric research programs for enhanced atmospheric effects. Ionospheric research programs. Daniel knew what that meant. He'd covered a story years ago about conspiracy theories surrounding HAARP, the high-frequency active auroral research program in Alaska. The official story was that HAARP studied the ionosphere for radio communications and surveillance purposes. The conspiracy theories claimed it was being used for weather control and mind manipulation. He pulled out his phone and searched for HAARP's founding date. Construction began in the early 90s. The facility became operational in the year Nirvana's lead singer died. The timing matched. Daniel found another document, this one from the year the Soviet Union dissolved. It was a memo discussing the involvement of outside consultants in the atmospheric projection research. 2 names were listed, Arthur C. Clarke, Richard Garwin. Daniel's heart rate increased. Those weren't random names. Those were giants in their fields. Arthur C. Clarke was one of the most famous science fiction authors of the 20th century, but he was also a legitimate scientist who predicted satellite communications decades before they became reality. He'd consulted with NASA and various government agencies throughout his career. Richard Garwin was a physicist who'd worked on the Manhattan Project and had been instrumental in developing laser weapons research for the military. He was one of the most respected scientists in defense circles. If these men had been involved, this wasn't some fringe pseudoscience project. This was serious research backed by serious people. Daniel kept digging through the files. He found technical specifications for satellite arrays capable of creating coordinated light patterns across multiple continents. He found psychological assessment reports analysing how different populations reacted to unexplained phenomena. He found test schedules and location coordinates and expected outcomes. And then he found the video log. It was a photocopy of a handwritten list, dated June of the year before the bicentennial. The heading read, Phase 3, Visual Documentation. Below it were timestamps and brief descriptions. 100 Hawaiians, 02.30, Introduction and Program Overview. 10:30, 08:15, White Sands Projection Test Footage, June. 15, 12:40, Alaska Ionospheric Trial, August. Twistlamp to Fide, 18E30, Coordinated Multi-Site Demonstration, October. 18 24, Se. Phase 4, Preliminary Concepts and Deployment Scenarios. Daniel looked at the VHS tape sitting on his counter. 24 minutes of footage, evidence of tests that were never publicly acknowledged. Proof that the technology Monast had warned about wasn't theoretical. It was real. It had been real for 30 years. He needed a VHS player. Those were hard to find in the modern age, but Daniel knew a local electronics shop that specialised in vintage equipment. He grabbed the tape in his jacket and headed out into the winter cold. The streets of Montreal were quiet, snow falling in soft flakes that melted on the sidewalk. Daniel walked quickly, his mind racing. If everything in these documents was real, if the tests had actually happened, then what else had Monast been right about? The electronics shop was run by an older man named Bernard, who specialised in converting old media to digital formats. Daniel had interviewed him once for a piece about obsolete technology. "I need this digitised," Daniel said, placing the tape on the counter. "How fast can you do it?" Bernard picked up the tape, examining it carefully. VHS in decent condition. Shouldn't take more than an hour. "You want it on a thumb drive?" "Please. And Bernard, this is important. Can you make sure nobody else sees this? Nobody makes a copy." Bernard raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll do it myself. Go get coffee. Come back in an hour." Daniel spent the next 60 minutes in a nearby cafe, staring at his laptop screen without really seeing it. His hands shook slightly every time he reached for his coffee cup. He kept thinking about Monast, about a 46-year-old man dying suddenly, just weeks after publishing his findings. About research that disappeared into storage for 2 decades. When he returned to the shop, Bernard handed him a thumb drive without comment. "Interesting footage," was all he said. Daniel thanked him and left quickly. He went straight home, locked his door, closed his blinds and plugged the drive into his laptop. The video began with static, then cleared to show a simple title card. Project Blue Beam, Phase 3 Documentation, Restricted Access. Then the static again, and then footage. The first segment showed what appeared to be a desert testing facility at night. White Sands, according to the timestamp. The camera was positioned on some kind of elevated platform pointing at the sky. For a few seconds nothing happened. Then, slowly, a point of light appeared in the darkness. It grew, expanded, took shape. Within 30 seconds there was a clearly defined object in the sky, glowing with a blue-white light. It looked like a classic flying saucer, complete with a domed top and rotating lights around its perimeter. It wasn't real. Daniel could see the slight shimmer in the air around it, the way the edges weren't quite solid. but from a distance, to an untrained observer, it would have been convincing. Very convincing. The object hovered for approximately 2 minutes, then slowly faded away. The next segment showed similar tests, each one more sophisticated than the last. Lights forming complex geometric patterns, shapes that appeared and disappeared. At one point, what looked like an enormous angel with spreading wings filled the frame, hovering over what the timestamp indicated was a test facility in Alaska. Daniel watched the entire 24 minutes without pausing. When it ended, he sat in silence for a long time. This was real. The technology existed. The tests had happened. Monast had been telling the truth. But if this was Phase 3, documented 27 years ago, what phase were they on now? And more importantly, why had this evidence survived at all? Why had it been allowed to sit in a storage locker for 2 decades, waiting to be found? Daniel looked at the final note Monast had left in the box. Exposure doesn't stop this. It only confirms that the program has moved beyond the point where exposure matters. He understood now. This wasn't a warning. This was a confirmation. If someone was finding this evidence, it meant the program was already complete. It meant whatever Bluebeam was designed to do, it was ready to happen. Or maybe it was already happening. Daniel opened a new document on his laptop and started typing. He was going to verify everything, every name, every date, every program. If this was real, the evidence would be in the public record, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the dots. He typed until dawn, the winter sun rising over Montreal, casting long shadows across his kitchen table, covered in documents that shouldn't exist. Evidence of a conspiracy that had been dismissed as paranoid fantasy. Proof that sometimes the paranoid fantasies are just early warnings of truths too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Part 2. The Foundation is real. The first thing Daniel did was verify everything he could. If this was a hoax, it would fall apart quickly. Conspiracy theories always do when you check the dates and names against historical records. The real world doesn't cooperate with elaborate fictions. Details don't match up. Timelines contradict each other. People who supposedly work together turn out to have never met. But these documents didn't fall apart. The more Daniel checked, the more solid they became. The timeline in Monast's files began in the summer of the year Psycho premiered in theatres, when NASA was officially founded as a civilian space agency. Daniel pulled up the National Aeronautics and Space Act, signed into law that July, creating NASA from the remnants of earlier military and civilian programs. On the surface, the whole operation was about beating the Soviets to the moon, about winning the space race, about demonstrating American technological superiority. But the memos in Daniel's possession suggested that from the very beginning, a subset of NASA engineers were tasked with something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with rockets or satellites or space exploration in the traditional sense. One memo, dated October of the year the Outer Space Treaty was signed, referenced a meeting between NASA officials and military intelligence officers about the potential use of high-orbit satellites for what the document called visual disruption and mass perception alteration. The meeting took place only months after the treaty banning weapons in space went into effect. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. They were discussing how to weaponize space while signing treaties promising not to. The language in the memo was careful, clinical, full of the kind of bureaucratic, passive voice that makes atrocities sound like paperwork, but the intent was clear. Preliminary assessments indicate that space-based optical systems, when coordinated with ground-based projection arrays, could generate atmospheric phenomena visible to large population centres. Applications include strategic deception, enemy resource diversion, and domestic population response modelling. Domestic population response modelling. Daniel had been a journalist long enough to know what that meant. It meant figuring out how to manipulate civilian populations. It meant psychological operations aimed at American citizens. He cross-referenced the memo's date with public NASA activities from that period. October of the year the treaty was signed, NASA was publicly focused on the Apollo program. The first manned mission to orbit the moon was still a year away. The agency was consumed with beating the Soviets, with proving that America could dominate space. But apparently some engineers were thinking about something else, about how the sky itself could become a tool. Daniel kept reading through the chronology. The next major document was dated the year Ronald Reagan was shot. That was when the president announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a program to develop space-based defense systems capable of intercepting ballistic missiles. The public knew it as Star Wars, and most of the debate focused on whether laser weapons could actually shoot down Soviet nukes, whether the technology was feasible, whether it violated the various arms control treaties. But buried in the SDI documentation Daniel found in Monast's files was a research branch that had received almost no public attention: advanced atmospheric manipulation and projection systems. The budget documents Daniel found showed funding for something called the Atmospheric Projection Division within SDI. The initial allocation was modest, barely $3 million in the first year, but it grew steadily. By the time the year Challenger exploded rolled around, the division was receiving over $20 million annually. The justification in the budget documents was always defensive. The official line was that the technology would create decoy targets in the sky to confuse enemy missile guidance systems. If Soviet missiles couldn't tell the difference between a real American city and a projected image of one, they might waste their warheads on empty desert. It was plausible. It fit within the strategic thinking of the time. But as Daniel read deeper into the technical reports, he saw the truth hidden in the language. The same technology that could create a decoy city could create anything: a false army, a fake disaster, an alien spacecraft, a religious vision, anything at all, projected into the sky for millions to see. A memo from June of the year Challenger exploded, signed by Lieutenant General James Abrahamson, the actual director of the SDI program, detailed significant progress. Ground-based coherent light projection systems have exceeded initial performance expectations. Recent trials at White Sands Missile Range demonstrated sustained visual phenomena at ranges exceeding 20 kilometers. Image stability has improved markedly with the integration of atmospheric sensing equipment. Visual fidelity is sufficient to create convincing representations of aircraft, missiles, and other objects of interest. Recommend expansion of testing program to include larger arrays and coordination with upper atmospheric research initiatives. Daniel pulled up everything he could find on Lieutenant General James Abrahamson. The man was real. He'd run SDI from its inception through the late 80s. He'd been a 3-star general in the Air Force, an astronaut candidate, a respected figure in defense circles. After leaving military service, he'd worked in private aerospace companies. If Abrahamson had signed off on atmospheric projection research, it wasn't fringe science. It was serious military development. White Sands Missile Range. Daniel knew the location. It was a massive military testing facility in New Mexico, spanning thousands of square miles of desert. It had been used for weapons testing since before NASA existed. The first atomic bomb had been detonated there. Missiles were tested there constantly. It was one of the most secretive military facilities in the country. Daniel searched for any public mention of atmospheric projection tests at White Sands in June of the year Challenger exploded. He found nothing. No news reports, no official acknowledgement, not even a mention in the base's publicly available testing schedules. But that wasn't unusual. White Sands conducted classified trials all the time. The absence of public records didn't mean the tests hadn't happened, it just meant they were secret. He kept reading through Monast's files following the chronology. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, SDI was being scaled back publicly. The Soviet threat was collapsing. The justification for Star Wars was disappearing along with the Soviet Union itself. Congress started cutting funding. Public interest waned. The program that had defined Reagan's defense policy was quietly being dismantled. But the atmospheric projection research didn't stop. If anything, the memo suggested it intensified. A document from early in the year the Soviet Union dissolved mentioned successful tests of large-scale aerial holographic projection and included a reference to outside consultants. The document specifically named Arthur C. Clarke and recommended his continued involvement in the theoretical development of the technology. Daniel researched Clarke extensively. The man wasn't just a science fiction author. He was a visionary who'd predicted satellite communications in a technical paper written in the year World War II ended, decades before the first satellites were launched. He'd worked with NASA as a consultant. He'd been respected by military planners and scientists across the world. And according to these documents, he'd been helping develop technology to create mass hallucinations in the sky. Another name appeared frequently in the later memos, Richard Garwin. Daniel found extensive documentation on him as well. Garwin was a physicist who'd worked on the hydrogen bomb. He'd been instrumental in developing laser technology for military applications. He'd consulted on missile defense, nuclear weapons policy, and classified programs most people had never heard of. The memo discussing Garwin's involvement was specific. Consultation with physicist Richard Garwin regarding feasibility of large-scale atmospheric refraction and ionospheric heating to create visual phenomena. Garwin's preliminary assessment suggests that focused electromagnetic radiation at specific frequencies could induce visible effects in the upper atmosphere. Recommends coordination with high-frequency active auroral research program in Alaska for practical trials. Ionospheric heating, upper atmosphere, Alaska, HAARP. Daniel knew about HAARP. Every conspiracy theorist knew about HAARP. The high-frequency active auroral research program had been a favourite target of speculation for decades. The official story was simple. It was a research facility designed to study the ionosphere for communications and surveillance purposes. The facility used high-powered radio transmitters to heat small portions of the ionosphere and measure the effects. But conspiracy theorists had claimed for years that HAARP was really about weather control, mind manipulation, earthquake generation, and a dozen other nefarious purposes. The theories had been dismissed as nonsense by mainstream media and scientists. But here in Monast's documents was proof that HAARP was in fact connected to Blue Beam, that the ionospheric research being conducted in Alaska was being coordinated with atmospheric projection technology. Daniel pulled up the official timeline for HAARP. Construction began in the early 90s. The facility became fully operational in the year the Unabomber was captured. The stated purpose never changed: ionospheric research for communications and surveillance. But according to these memos, there was another purpose: using the ionosphere itself as a projection screen. Daniel found a technical document that explained the concept. The ionosphere, the upper layer of Earth's atmosphere, could be manipulated by powerful radio transmissions. When heated in specific ways, it would glow, creating visible light. By coordinating multiple transmission sources, patterns could be created. Images, shapes, objects that would appear to be floating in the sky but were actually just excited particles in the upper atmosphere. It was brilliant and terrifying. Because if you could make the ionosphere glow in controlled patterns, you could create almost anything. With enough coordination and enough power, you could fill the sky with images visible across entire continents. Then Daniel found the memo that made his hands shake. It was dated March of the year Kurt Cobain died. The author's name had been redacted, but the subject line was clear: Civilian Response Trial, Phoenix Metropolitan Area. The memo was brief. Per previous authorization, large-scale atmospheric projection trial scheduled for March of next year. Location: Phoenix, Arizona. Population approximately 2 million. Expected weather conditions: clear skies, minimal cloud cover. Projection array: coordinated ground-based and satellite systems. Target visual: large triangular formation moving at subsonic speeds. Expected result: mass sighting event with multiple independent witnesses and media coverage. Objective: assess civilian response patterns, media amplification factors, and official explanation acceptance rates. Daniel stopped breathing for a moment. Phoenix, March of the year after this memo. He knew exactly what that meant. He opened a new browser window and searched. Phoenix lights. The results filled his screen. March of the year the Hale-Bopp comet was visible, specifically the 13th day of that month. Thousands of people across Arizona reported seeing a massive V-shaped object in the sky, silent and enormous, drifting slowly over the city. The object was described as being massive, possibly larger than any aircraft ever built. Witnesses included pilots, police officers, government officials. Hundreds of videos were taken. The governor of Arizona initially mocked the incident, then years later admitted he'd seen it too and couldn't explain it. It became one of the most famous mass UFO sightings in history. Books were written about it. Television shows investigated it. Researchers spent decades trying to understand what thousands of people had seen that night. The military's explanation was flares. They claimed it was illumination flares dropped during a training exercise at the Barry Goldwater Range southwest of Phoenix. But according to the memo in front of Daniel, it had been scheduled 3 years in advance. It had been a test, a trial run of mass projection technology, an experiment to see how a population would react to an unexplained phenomenon in the sky. And it had worked perfectly. People had seen what they'd been shown. They'd reacted predictably. The media had covered it extensively. And the official explanation, however implausible, had been accepted by most people. The memo even had a follow-up assessment, dated 2 months after the Phoenix event. Phoenix trial exceeded expectations. Media coverage sustained for over 72 hours. Official explanation accepted by approximately 60% of population, despite significant logical inconsistencies, remaining 40% divided between extraterrestrial hypothesis and general skepticism. No witnesses connected phenomenon to projection technology. Recommend expanded trials in international locations with varied cultural backgrounds. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of his apartment. This changed everything. The Phoenix lights weren't a UFO sighting. They weren't flares. They were a psychological operation, a test of technology that could make thousands of people see something that wasn't there. And if they could do that in the late 90s, what could they do now, 25 years later, with advances in computer technology, satellite systems, and understanding of human psychology? He kept digging through the documents, creating spreadsheets, building timelines, verifying every name and date he could. The pattern was undeniable. Every piece fit, every name checked out, every program was real. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. This was a conspiracy fact. And according to Monast's final note, the program had been ready to go operational before the journalist died. That was more than 20 years ago. If it was ready then, what had they been doing in the decades since? Daniel needed to find people who'd been involved. People who could confirm these documents were real. People who could tell him what had happened to the program after Monast died. He started making a list of people to contact. Former NASA engineers, retired military personnel, anyone who might have worked on SDI or atmospheric research programs in the 80s and 90s. It was time to find out just how deep this went. Part 3. The People Who Knew. Finding Jacques Letourneau took Daniel 3 days of research and phone calls. The man had worked with Serge Monast in the early 90s, co-authoring several investigative pieces about government surveillance and the erosion of privacy rights. After Monast's death, Letourneau had largely disappeared from journalism, retiring to a small town outside Quebec City. Daniel finally tracked him down through an old journalism directory and a series of increasingly specific Google searches. When he called the number he'd found, an older man answered on the fourth ring. "Jacques Le Tourneau?" Daniel asked in French. There was a long pause. "Who's asking?" "My name is Daniel Rousseau. I'm a reporter in Montreal. I recently inherited some materials that belong to Serge Monast. I was hoping we could talk about them." The silence on the other end lasted so long Daniel thought the man had hung up. Then, I wondered when someone would finally open that box. They arranged to meet at a diner off the highway between Montreal and Quebec City. Neutral ground, public enough to be safe, quiet enough to talk. Daniel arrived early, ordering coffee and taking a booth near the back with a clear view of the entrance. The diner was the kind of place that probably hadn't changed its decor since the 80s. Worn vinyl seats, formica tables, menus printed on laminated paper. A handful of truckers sat at the counter drinking coffee and eating eggs. Le Tourneau arrived exactly on time. Daniel recognised him from an old photo he'd found online, though the man had aged considerably. He was in his 70s now, thin and grey, with the cautious eyes of someone who'd spent a lifetime asking dangerous questions and learning to be careful about the answers. He slid into the booth across from Daniel without offering his hand. "You have the files," he said. It wasn't a question. "I do. Did you know my aunt was storing them?" "Claire Rousseau. Yes, I knew. Serge gave them to her a week before he died. Told her someone would come asking eventually." Le Tourneau ordered coffee from a waitress who looked like she'd been working there since the restaurant opened. "You've read them?" "Most of them, and I watched the tape." Le Tourneau's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. "Then you know what he found." "I know what the documents say. I want to know if it's real." The old journalist stirred sugar into his coffee with deliberate slowness, his eyes scanning the diner. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Sergei wasn't crazy. I know that's what everyone thought. The media painted him as paranoid, delusional, a conspiracy theorist who'd lost his grip on reality. But I worked with him for years. I knew him, and I knew when he found something real. What did he find? Access. That's what it came down to. In the early 90s, Serge was working on a piece about satellite communication security. He had a source at a telecommunications company that handled uplinks for various government agencies, including NASA. The source showed him scheduling data, transmission protocols, satellite coordinates, normal stuff for a technical investigation. Le Tourneau paused to sip his coffee, but Serge noticed patterns, specific satellite arrays activating at specific times, transmitting on frequencies that didn't match their official specifications. And when he cross-referenced those activation times with unexplained aerial phenomena reports, they matched perfectly. "Phoenix?" Daniel asked. Among others. Phoenix was the most famous, but there were dozens of smaller incidents. Lights over Norway, strange clouds over China, geometric patterns over Australia. Every time the satellite arrays had been active hours beforehand, warming up, calibrating. Serge realised what he was looking at. NASA wasn't just studying these phenomena, they were creating them. Why? Le Tourneau shrugged, but his eyes were hard. Control, testing, preparation. Serge believed they were perfecting the technology for something bigger. He found references in some internal documents to a program called Blue Beam. The details were sparse, but the implication was clear. They were going to stage something massive, something that would convince people that their entire understanding of reality needed to change. A fake alien invasion? That was one theory. Serge also thought they might stage religious events, apparitions of religious figures appearing in the sky. Depending on the region, different figures. Jesus in Christian countries, the Mahdi in Muslim regions, various others adapted to local beliefs. The goal would be to create a global spiritual crisis that could be managed, guided toward unified thinking, toward acceptance of global governance. Daniel felt cold despite the warm diner. Did he have proof? He had documents, some of what you have now. memos, budget reports, technical specifications. But when he tried to publish, everything went wrong. His main source disappeared, his editor killed the story, and then the authorities started harassing him. What kind of harassment? His partner was arrested on false charges. Tax fraud, they claimed, though the evidence was fabricated. Serge's bank accounts were frozen pending an investigation that never materialised. His phone was tapped. His apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen, just searched. They were sending a message. They wanted him to know he was being watched. And then he died. Letourneau nodded slowly. Heart attack. Sudden. Fatal. At 46 years old with no prior heart problems. I was one of the last people to talk to him. 2 days before he died, he called me, said he'd secured the documents, given them to someone he trusted to keep them safe, said if anything happened to him, someone would find them eventually. Did you believe him? About Blue Beam? The old man was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. At first, I thought he was paranoid, reading too much into coincidences, connecting dots that weren't really there. But after he died, I started looking into it myself, quietly, carefully. And you know what I found? What? Everything checked out. The programs were real. The technology existed. The test had happened. Every verifiable claim Serge made was accurate. It wasn't paranoia. It was investigative journalism. He'd found something true, and it got him killed. You think he was murdered? I think a 46-year-old man in good health doesn't just die of a heart attack weeks after publishing findings that embarrass powerful government agencies. I think technology exists to induce heart attacks remotely. I think Serge knew too much and wouldn't stop talking about it. Draw your own conclusions. Daniel pulled out his laptop and showed Letourneau some of the documents he'd scanned. The old journalist examined them carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each page. These are the originals, he said finally. I recognise some of them. Serge showed them to me before everything fell apart. He looked up at Daniel. You need to be very careful with these. The people behind this program, they're still out there. They're still active. And if they think you're becoming a problem... I'm a local news reporter. I write about city council meetings. Who's going to pay attention to me? That's what Serge thought, right up until they destroyed his life. Letourneau leaned across the table. Listen to me. If you're going to pursue this, do it smart. Verify everything independently. Build redundancies. Make sure the information exists in multiple places. And understand that publishing might not stop anything. It might just confirm that you found something real. Mona said the same thing in his note. That exposure doesn't stop the program. Because by the time you find evidence, the program has already moved beyond the point where exposure matters. They're confident enough to let the evidence exist. That should tell you something. They talked for another hour. Letourneau provided names of other people who might be willing to talk. Former colleagues of Monast, researchers who'd looked into similar phenomena, people who'd worked in aerospace or defence and had seen things that didn't quite add up. When they finally parted, Letourneau grasped Daniel's arm at the door. One more thing, he said quietly. Serge died in December, right before Christmas. The same week his partner was arrested. The same week his bank accounts were frozen. They timed it deliberately. Maximum disruption during the holidays when everyone's distracted. If you start feeling pressure, if authorities suddenly take an interest in your taxes or your personal life, get somewhere public and stay there. Daniel drove back to Montreal with his hands tight on the steering wheel, Letourneau's warnings echoing in his mind. The next interview was harder to arrange. The retired NASA engineer wouldn't give his name and refused to meet in person. They settled on a phone call through an encrypted messaging app, with the engineer calling from what he claimed was a prepaid phone that couldn't be traced. I can't tell you much, the man said when the call connected. His voice was distorted, either naturally or through some kind of filter. But I can tell you the atmospheric projection division was real. It wasn't a big program, maybe 20 people at its peak, but the technology worked. How well did it work? Well enough. We could create images in the sky using intersecting laser arrays and ionospheric manipulation. Nothing huge at first, nothing solid, but enough to make people look up and wonder. By the time I left the program in the year Lewinsky's scandal dominated the news, we could project convincing representations of aircraft, geometric shapes, even crude moving images. Range was limited to maybe 50 kilometres, but the fidelity was improving constantly. What was it for? Officially, decoys, missile defence, creating false targets to waste enemy resources. But we all knew it could be used for other things. Psychological operations, mass deception, making people see things that weren't there, making them question what was real. Why did you leave? The engineer was quiet for a moment. Because I realised where it was heading. We started getting requirements that didn't make sense for missile defence. Requests to develop systems that could create humanoid figures, religious symbols, things that looked organic rather than mechanical. That's when I knew this wasn't about defence anymore. It was about something else, something I didn't want to be part of. What happened to the program after you left? I don't know for certain, but I kept track of funding through people I stayed in contact with. After SDI was officially ended, the atmospheric projection research went deep black. Classified above top secret. Budgets became impossible to track, but the money was still flowing. That tells you the program didn't stop, it just went invisible. Do you think it's still active? I think technology like that doesn't just disappear, I think it gets better. I think whatever they were developing in the 90s, they've perfected by now. And I think if they ever decide to use it at full scale... The engineer trailed off. What? Most people won't be able to tell the difference between what's real and what's projected. That's the whole point. That's what we were building toward. A system so sophisticated, so convincing, that consensus reality itself becomes negotiable. The call ended shortly after. Daniel sat in his apartment staring at his notes. The third interview came through an unexpected channel. Daniel had reached out to several retired Air Force personnel who'd been stationed at classified research facilities in the 90s. Most didn't respond. A few sent brief replies saying they couldn't help. But one, a former intelligence linguist who'd worked at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, agreed to communicate through encrypted messages. The linguist refused to provide even basic identifying information, using only a randomly generated username. But the details in the messages suggested genuine insider knowledge. I worked signals intelligence at Kirtland from the year the first Gulf War started, through the year the Monica Lewinsky story broke. My job was translating intercepted communications related to foreign military research programs. Specifically, we were tracking Soviet and Chinese attempts to develop atmospheric manipulation technologies similar to what we were working on. Daniel typed back. So other countries were developing this too? Absolutely. The Soviets had a program called Project Aurora that was focused on creating visual phenomena in the sky. The Chinese had something similar, but we were ahead. By the mid-90s we had functional systems. I saw the test footage. Not just static images, but moving objects. Things that looked like aircraft, but weren't there. Shapes that appeared solid, but were just light and excited particles. How convincing was it? Very. We would run tests and then intercept the local radio traffic. Phone calls from people reporting strange lights. They couldn't tell it was artificial. To them, it was just unexplained phenomena. We even had a few instances where local news picked up the stories. Of course, official explanations were always provided. Weather balloons, atmospheric conditions, military exercises, whatever would make people stop asking questions. What happened to the program after the Cold War ended? It evolved. That's the thing people don't understand. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the justification for these programs didn't disappear. It just changed. Instead of defending against external enemies, the focus shifted to domestic applications, managing perception, controlling narratives. The technology we developed for strategic deception in warfare became a tool for information warfare at home. You're saying they turned it on American citizens. I'm saying the capability exists. Whether it's been deployed at scale, I can't confirm, but I can tell you that by the time I left the service, there was extensive discussion about using these systems for what they called narrative reinforcement operations, creating visual phenomena that would support specific policy goals or diplomatic initiatives, like staging a crisis or staging a solution. Imagine if a major international problem was emerging, something that required unprecedented cooperation or changes to existing power structures. Now imagine if a visual phenomenon appeared in the sky, something that seemed to confirm the narrative being pushed by authorities, something that made people more willing to accept radical changes because they'd seen evidence with their own eyes. That's terrifying. That's the world we live in. The technology exists, the infrastructure is in place. The only question is whether anyone has the will to activate it at full scale. The messages continued over several days. The linguist provided technical details about the systems, described organisational structures, confirmed names and programs that appeared in Monaster's documents. Everything lined up. Every piece fit. Daniel compiled all of his interviews into a growing file, cross-referencing testimonies, verifying claims wherever possible. 3 different sources, none of whom knew each other, all confirming the same basic facts. The technology was real. The program had existed since at least the 80s. It had gone black in the 90s and continued developing. The capability to create mass visual phenomena existed and had been tested repeatedly. The only question was whether it had ever been deployed for real, whether any of the unexplained phenomena of the past 30 years had been genuine or manufactured. Daniel started building a timeline of incidents, not just famous cases like Phoenix, but any mass sighting, any unexplained aerial phenomenon, any event that had generated widespread witness reports and media coverage. The pattern that emerged was chilling. Part 4. The Incidents That Match. Daniel spent 2 weeks cross-referencing Monaster's files with documented unexplained phenomena. He created a massive spreadsheet with dates, locations, descriptions, and any correlation with the test schedules and satellite data in the documents. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious. These events were scattered across decades and continents. But when Daniel organised them chronologically and marked the ones that appeared in Monaster's files, a clear progression emerged. The earliest reference in the documents was from the year before the new millennium, Norway. Multiple reports of strange spiral lights in the sky appeared in local newspapers from northern regions. The official explanation at the time was Aurora Borealis with unusual configurations, but in Monaster's files was a test schedule marked Scandinavian Population Response Trials, December. The descriptions matched. Spiral formations in the sky, glowing with unusual colours, appearing and disappearing over several nights. The memos noted that the test had been successful, with high witness credibility and minimal scepticism from local populations. Then nothing major for several years, at least nothing in the files. But the year Princess Diana died brought the Phoenix lights, already documented extensively in Daniel's research. The memo had scheduled it 3 years in advance. The test had exceeded expectations. What Daniel found disturbing was the follow-up analysis in the files. Pages of data about media coverage, witness reliability assessments, official explanation acceptance rates. They'd studied every aspect of how the event had played out. They had learned from it, used it to refine their understanding of mass psychology. The next major incident in the files was from late in the first decade of the new millennium, December of the year Copenhagen hosted the climate summit, the Norway spiral. Daniel remembered this one clearly. It had been all over the news at the time. A massive blue and white spiral appeared in the sky over northern Norway, visible for hundreds of kilometres. The geometric perfection of it had been stunning. Videos showed a perfect spiral of blue light with a white glow at the centre, as if someone had drawn it in the sky with a compass. The official explanation came within hours: a failed Russian missile test from the White Sea. The trajectory had spiraled out of control, creating the visual effect. The Russian military eventually confirmed the explanation, but the geometry had been too perfect, the timing too precise, the duration too long. A missile failure would create debris, erratic motion, rapid dissipation. The Norway spiral had maintained its formation for nearly 10 minutes, and in Monist's files was a memo dated 2 weeks before the event. Arctic atmospheric trial scheduled for December. Coordinates: northern Norway, approximately 70 degrees latitude. Expected weather: clear, minimal light pollution. Test objective: large-scale geometric formation using coordinated satellite array and ground-based ionospheric stimulation. Secondary objective: assess effectiveness of rapid official explanation deployment. Cover story: Russian missile malfunction. The cover story had been prepared in advance. They'd coordinated with Russian authorities, or at least created a plausible scenario that Russia could confirm. The spiral wasn't a missile failure, it was a test, and the official explanation had worked exactly as designed. Daniel found witness accounts from the Norway spiral. Thousands of people had seen it, photographed it, filmed it, and most of them had accepted the missile explanation without question, even though the physics didn't quite make sense. That was the genius of it. Provide an official explanation quickly, even if it's not entirely logical, and most people will accept it rather than entertain more disturbing possibilities. The timeline continued. October of a year in the middle of the current decade. Shanghai, China. Thousands of people reported seeing what appeared to be a floating city in the clouds, a massive mirage of skyscrapers hovering above the real skyline. Videos went viral on social media. News stations covered it as a fascinating meteorological phenomenon. Meteorologists called it a fata morgana, a complex form of superior mirage that can make distant objects appear to float in the air. The explanation was technically plausible. Fata morganas are real optical phenomena caused by temperature inversions, but in Monist's files was a reference. East Asia Urban Projection Sample, October. Test parameters: dense urban environment, high population density, extensive social media penetration. Objective: assess viral information spread in digitally connected population. They tested how quickly an unexplained phenomenon would spread through social media. How many people would film it, share it, discuss it. They'd studied the patterns of information flow in the age of smartphones and instant communication. Daniel found dozens of smaller incidents: lights over military bases, geometric formations over remote areas, objects that appeared and disappeared. Every major unexplained sky event from the past 30 years had a corresponding entry in the files. Not all of them. Some incidents were probably genuine unexplained phenomena, but enough of them matched the test schedules to establish a pattern. They'd been testing for decades, refining the technology, learning how populations react, studying how information spreads, how official explanations are accepted or rejected, how media coverage affects public perception. Each test built on the previous ones. Each incident taught them something new about mass psychology and information control. The most recent entry in Monist's files was from the year before he died, but Daniel knew the testing hadn't stopped when Monist discovered it. If anything, it had probably intensified. He started searching for unexplained phenomena from after Monist's death. The pattern continued. Norway had another spiral in the year the Panama Papers were released. There were strange lights over multiple US military bases in the year before the last presidential election. Geometric formations over South America. Massive glowing orbs over cities in Europe and Asia. Some of these had received media coverage. Others had been dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but the frequency was increasing. The sophistication was growing. Daniel created visualizations of the data, maps showing locations, timelines showing frequency, graphs showing the increasing complexity of the phenomena. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't random. This was systematic testing of technology designed to control what people saw in the sky. But testing for what? What was the ultimate goal? Daniel went back to Monast's note. They've spent 30 years perfecting the technology, another 20 integrating it into the infrastructure. If Monast had discovered this in the mid-90s, and the program had been running since the 60s, that was 30 years of development. Monast died more than 20 years ago. That was another 2 decades of refinement and integration. They weren't testing anymore, they were ready. The question was, ready for what? Part 5. After the towers fell. Daniel noticed something change in the document's timeline. After September of the year the towers fell, the nature of the program shifted fundamentally. He found this pattern not in Monast's files, which ended in the mid-90s, but in public records, budget documents, policy papers, congressional testimony, all publicly available, all hiding in plain sight. Between the year the towers fell and the middle of the following decade, there was an explosion in funding for psychological operations, electronic warfare, and something the documents called perception management. The Department of Defense budget showed billions allocated to programs with deliberately vague names: strategic communications, information dominance, cognitive security, narrative operations. Daniel pulled up the actual budget documents from those years. They were publicly available through the Freedom of Information Act, though heavily redacted. But even with the redactions, the numbers told a story. In the year before the towers fell, spending on psychological operations across all military branches totaled roughly 300 million. By the year the housing market began to collapse, that number had increased to over 4 billion. The budget line items were scattered across different agencies, different departments, different classification levels. But Daniel tracked them all, compiling a spreadsheet that showed the massive increase in spending on what essentially amounted to domestic information control. It wasn't just military spending. Intelligence agencies received similar increases. The Department of Homeland Security, created in the aftermath of the attacks, had entire divisions dedicated to countering disinformation and information security that were really about shaping public perception of threats and government responses. Then in the year the housing market collapsed, something interesting appeared in the Federal Register. A notice about the creation of something called the National Applications Office. Daniel had never heard of it, so he researched extensively. The NE was designed to coordinate the use of spy satellites for domestic purposes. The official justification was Homeland Security, disaster response, and border security. Intelligence agencies already had satellites watching the entire planet. Why not use that capability to help domestic agencies? The backlash was immediate. Privacy advocates raised alarms. Congressional committees expressed concerns. The media actually paid attention for once, running stories about Big Brother watching American citizens from space. The NAO was officially shut down before it even became operational. The announcement came within months of its creation. A victory for privacy, the headlines proclaimed. But Daniel found documents showing that while the NAO itself was disbanded, the infrastructure remained. The satellite coordination systems were transferred to other agencies. The legal frameworks were preserved under different names. The program hadn't been killed, it had just gone invisible. That was a pattern Daniel kept seeing. Programs would be announced, face public criticism, get officially ended, but the core capabilities would continue under different names in different agencies. Around the same time, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, began launching a series of projects that caught Daniel's attention. DARPA had always been at the cutting edge of military technology. They'd created the internet, GPS, stealth technology, and dozens of other innovations that eventually became civilian products. But in the years following the year the towers fell, their focus shifted towards something different. brain-computer interfaces, neural manipulation, what they called neurotechnology for national security. Daniel found public documents about these programs. They weren't secret. DARPA published papers about their research. They held conferences. They recruited from universities. One program was called Silent Talk. The goal was to allow soldiers to communicate through thought alone, using neural interfaces that could detect and transmit brain signals. The potential military applications were obvious: silent communication in combat zones, coordination without radio chatter. But Daniel saw the other implications. If you could detect what someone was thinking and transmit it, you could also potentially send signals back. You could potentially influence thought itself. Another program was called Narrative Networks. The official description was about understanding how narratives and stories shape group behaviour and decision-making. The goal was to develop ways to counter extremist narratives and promote pro-social messaging. But the research went deeper than that. It explored how specific narratives could be crafted to influence large populations, how stories could be deployed strategically to shape public opinion, how psychological triggers could be identified and exploited. Then there was biological control. This program aimed to use electromagnetic stimulation to trigger specific biological responses in the brain. The official goal was treating PTSD and traumatic brain injuries in soldiers, but the underlying technology could theoretically be used to induce specific mental states in targeted individuals. Daniel compiled all of this research. He cross-referenced it with the atmospheric projection technology from Monist's files, and he started to see how everything connected. The holographic projection technology from the 80s and 90s could control what people saw. The neurotechnology research from the 2000s and beyond could influence what people thought and felt. The information control infrastructure established after the towers fell could manage how people interpreted what they saw and felt. Together, it was a complete system for managing human perception at scale. He found an article from the year before the last presidential election. A retired DARPA scientist had written an op-ed piece published in a small tech journal. The article was critical of what the scientist called weaponized psychology in government programs. Daniel tracked down the full piece. One paragraph jumped out. What began as defensive technology has become something else entirely. We told ourselves we were developing tools to counter foreign propaganda, to protect soldiers from psychological warfare, to help citizens distinguish truth from disinformation. But we've built something more powerful and more dangerous. We've created the ability to shape consensus reality itself, to make people see what we want them to see, believe what we want them to believe, feel what we want them to feel, and we've done it all in the name of national security. Daniel tried to contact the scientist. The email bounced back. The phone number was disconnected. A search for the scientist's name revealed that he died 2 years after publishing the article. Heart attack, age 63, another heart attack, another inconvenient death. Daniel kept digging. He found evidence of the infrastructure being integrated into civilian systems. Social media companies working with intelligence agencies to develop disinformation detection algorithms that could also be used to suppress information. Telecommunications companies installing hardware that allowed monitoring and potentially manipulation of communications. Smart city initiatives that created surveillance networks capable of tracking entire populations. None of it was hidden. It was all public information, just scattered across thousands of different sources, buried in technical documents and budget reports and policy papers that nobody read. The infrastructure for total information control had been built in plain sight. And then Daniel found the leaked email. It was posted on a fringe forum dedicated to tracking government surveillance programs. The poster claimed to have received it from a friend who worked in cybersecurity consulting for defense contractors. The email was allegedly from a retired DARPA scientist to a former colleague, dated the year after the pandemic began. Daniel verified what he could. The email header data suggested it was genuine, though it could have been forged. The scientist's name checked out. He'd worked on several neurotechnology programs in the 2000s, but confirming the content was impossible. The email was brief. I saw your piece in the Journal of Defense Technology. Good work documenting the network architecture, but you're still thinking too small. Project Bluebeam was never cancelled. It was upgraded. The holographic projection was only ever part of it. The real goal was always psychological, making people see what you want them to see, believe what you want them to believe. With modern technology, AI-generated content, deepfakes, voice, synthesis, ubiquitous surveillance, you don't even need the holograms anymore. You can create entire realities, custom-tailored to specific populations or even individuals. The infrastructure is in place. The capability exists. All that's missing is the activation order. Daniel read the email a dozen times. Then he started researching the current state of the technologies mentioned. Deepfakes had become nearly perfect. AI systems could generate video of anyone saying anything, with perfect lip sync and natural expressions. Voice synthesis could clone anyone's voice from a few minutes of audio samples. Image generation had reached the point where artificial images were indistinguishable from photographs. Social media algorithms could create completely different information environments for different users, showing them content calibrated to their existing beliefs and emotional triggers. Search engines could manipulate what information people found. Digital maps could show different routes to different people. Weather apps could display different forecasts. Reality itself had become customizable, not through holograms in the sky, but through the screens everyone carried in their pockets. The atmospheric projection technology wasn't obsolete. It was just one tool in a much larger toolkit. Daniel thought about the implications. If you could control what people saw on their screens and in the sky, if you could influence what they thought and felt through targeted content and electromagnetic stimulation, if you could manage what information they had access to and what explanations they would accept for unexplained events, you could shape reality itself, not physical reality, but consensus reality, the shared understanding of what's true, what's important, what's happening in the world, and whoever controlled that controlled everything. Daniel's research was interrupted by a notification on his phone, an alert from his banking app. His account had been flagged for suspicious activity and temporarily frozen pending investigation. He called the bank immediately. They couldn't provide details over the phone but asked him to come in to discuss the matter. They made an appointment for later that week. Daniel felt cold. He thought about Letourneau's warning, about what had happened to Monast. He backed up everything immediately, uploaded copies of all his research to multiple cloud services, sent encrypted copies to several journalist friends with instructions not to open them unless something happened to him, made physical backups on USB drives that he hid in different locations. He wasn't paranoid, he was being careful, because he was starting to understand that Monast had been right about all of it, and people who were right about this kind of thing tended to have unfortunate accidents. Part 6. The Hidden Division. Daniel filed his Freedom of Information Act request with NASA in March. He wasn't expecting much. FOA requests to government agencies typically returned either heavily redacted documents or outright denials based on national security exemptions. But he had to try. He requested any and all documents related to the Atmospheric Projection Division within the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Theoretical Event Projection Unit, any programs or research related to large-scale atmospheric visual phenomena, budget documents for any programs related to ionospheric manipulation for projection purposes. He also requested, somewhat optimistically, any documents related to coordination between NASA and DARPA on perception management or psychological operations. The response came 3 months later. A thick envelope containing mostly redacted documents, and a letter explaining that much of the